So welcome to the Professional Development Institute of the University of Ottawa, and it's also home to the Information Integrity Lab. Before we proceed, we affirm that the University of Ottawa pays respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from across Canada who call Ottawa home, and we pledge to work closely with them in the exercise of our mandate. I'm Jennifer Irish. I'm the director of the Information Integrity Lab, but I'm also today's event moderator. Fun fact, in my previous career in foreign affairs, I spent 6 years as a senior negotiator of climate change, the Climate Change Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. This is not a climate change conference, but I'm delighted that our work on information integrity and mis and disinformation permits us to investigate narratives which can distort the public perception and also can impede action on this existential crisis of climate change. And more on that later. I wish to acknowledge with appreciation today representatives of the Trottier Family Foundation, in particular its executive director, Monsieur Eric Saint-Pierre, whose support for this work is indispensable, and also reps of Le Centre de Recherche Informatique de Montréal, CRIM, who's a key partner with us, especially on visual disinformation. Two quick housekeeping announcements. Each table has been provided with one hard copy. We try to save on paper, so one hard copy of our literature review on climate change and climate disinformation. Do not be distracted by it. Electronic copies have been circulated. It's a contextual document only, which has informed the choice of themes for the first stage of our work plan in preparing priorities for the Summit on Climate Change and Mis and Disinformation next year. I will have more to say on that when I address you as the director of the Information Integrity Lab later in the session. Secondly, bios of our esteemed speakers have also been circulated to each table. So we'll run a tight event by not repeating all of their many, many great achievements which have brought them here with us today. I look forward to sharing with you perspectives and planning of the Information Integrity Lab. But without further ado, I present a key leader whose vision and enthusiasm have been indispensable to the foundation of the Information Integrity Lab, the head and executive of this institute, Monsieur Serge Bellet.
Bonjour, bienvenue à l'Université d'Ottawa, à l'Institut de développement professionnel. So welcome to the university where we create knowledge and where our mission is the dissemination of science-based information. As such, we feel compelled to take action when we see the spread of disinformation and how it hinders the advancement of knowledge. And this is why we're here, and this is why we do this. A little over 2 years ago, I think it was, the University of Ottawa Professional Development created the Information Integrity Lab, focused on better understanding the phenomenon of disinformation, on its impact on the dissemination of scientific knowledge, and on ways to mitigate its negative effects across society, governments, and private sector organizations. We're here today to discuss how disinformation adds confusion to the already complex field of climate change and how it impedes necessary action and what we can do about it. But we're also here to thank the Trottier Family Foundation for their ongoing support on climate change science, committing up to $50 million to help identify solutions. Not just for us, for a bunch of other people. And to thank the Trottier Family Foundation, of course, for their generous support of the Information Integrity Lab's initiative on climate change disinformation. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Saint-Pierre. On aura la chance de s'en reparler. Climate change science has made great advances in recent years, and many of you in this room have contributed to this advancement. The causes of climate change are much better understood, and although there is still a healthy debate around solutions, a path forward has emerged. Many organizations like the University of Ottawa, and I know Carleton University as well, have set carbon neutrality commitments and sustainable practices. But for the average citizen, for the average policymaker, for the average decision maker, the subtleties of climate change science can be difficult to understand. Add on top of that a thick layer of disinformation, and the picture quickly becomes very confusing. Dave McMahon, my colleague Dave McMahon, was showing me a very scary picture of all the climate denying organizations in Canada. There are not like 5, 6, or 7, like there must be, Dave, where are you? There must be 50, 100, 200, I don't know. And they're all interrelated. And he's able to figure out, where they're from, where they get the financing. And it's a daunting task when you see that. Still, let's stay optimistic. And this is why we're here today, to see how we can, how disinformation, as we see it today, slows down much needed action on climate change. Alors, merci pour votre participation aujourd'hui. Bien que cet événement, tel qu'annoncé, va se dérouler en anglais, nous vous encourageons à poser vos questions en français comme si vous le désirez. On va s'assurer de fournir l'interprétation au besoin. And I'll turn it back to our director, Jennifer Irish, for the introduction to our first keynote speaker. All the way from Texas, I think, right? Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Serge. And I'd also just like to indicate that we are videotaping the event today, so that we have also something that we can share after the event, so just so you're aware. We will explore 2 framing themes in our launch today. One is on how the challenge faced by climate change scientists in communicating science in an age of mis and disinformation. And the second is how mis and disinformation distorts public perceptions of the crisis and impedes action. We have with us to launch our event and our work program, one of the esteemed leaders in this field. We are deeply honored to have as our inaugural speaker, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. I'm just looking at the tech people. Do we have Katharine Hayhoe? Hello. Dr. Hayhoe, it's a pleasure. So we're deeply honored to have you as our inaugural speaker. Dr. Hayhoe, amongst her many, many accomplishments, which are enumerated in her bio at your table, is a leading atmospheric scientist, a UN champion of the Earth, and the chief scientist for the Nature Conservatory. And Dr. Hayhoe, we're in your good hands.
So I am joining you all the way from Texas, but I am not a Texan. I am from Toronto. And, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, especially, we would have said, why is a climate scientist speaking at a misinformation and disinformation event? In fact, to be totally honest, until I moved to the States for grad school, which I did in the 90s, I had never met someone who didn't think climate change was real. My perspective at that time was that the sky is blue, the grass is green, and climate is changing due to human activities. And the main concern that I had at that time, when I first learned how urgent climate change is and how unfair climate change is, how it affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally, and those who've done the least to cause the problem are bearing the brunt of the impacts. The biggest concern I had was that most of us at that time, and frankly still today, see climate change as a distant issue. We see it as one that affects people in the future, not here, not now. One that affects people who live over there, but not here. And one that matters to people like David Suzuki and Elizabeth May and anybody called Catherine, at least the 2 of us who are in the room there. But it doesn't matter to anybody else. So that was really my primary concern. And when I moved to the States, it actually took me a little while to figure out that there was quite a few people already at that time who didn't think climate change is real. And then now, fast forward to 2024, I'm very sorry to say that this perspective has certainly spread across the border. In fact, I sort of monitor perspectives from the polling data, but also from all the trolling I get online. And I can say that although the majority of the trolling I receive online still comes from what appear to be US sources, about a third of it these days is bots, but about sadly 2/3 of it is not. Although the majority comes from the US, there is a very healthy amount that comes from Canada. It does not only come from Saskatchewan or Alberta, there's quite a bit that comes from Toronto itself. In fact, one of the epithets I commonly get is a high priestess of the climate cult. or I've also been called the handmaiden of the Antichrist. And that first came from a man from Toronto. So this is really spread across our borders, and I see it also in the UK. I see it in the EU. I see this coming from around the world. But when I click on these social media profiles or when I read the emails I get, it is very clear that every single one of those is accompanied by a toxic stew of political views, of which climate denial is only one. It is very rare to find someone who is only into climate denial but nothing else. It is part and package of something that is completely tied to identity and to political ideology, to the point where, as I'll talk about today, we have even seen new denial being introduced into these packages of ideology and taken up very rapidly. So sharing today was really fun, I have to say, because this is something that I think about a lot and I look at a lot. And in fact, I even serve on a World Economic Forum task force looking at misinformation and how it puts our future at risk. So I want to share 7 things with you today. And let me get my screen shared with you. Just a second here. It looks like I can. Yes. Let me get my screen shared with you and we can begin. So I don't know if any of you are Calvin and Hobbes fans, but I just feel like this cartoon really summarizes where we are. We live in times where people don't trust the government, they don't trust the legal system, they don't trust the media, they don't trust each other. We've undermined all authority and with it the basis for replacing it, says Calvin. Hobbes says, interesting is a mild way of putting it. And Calvin says, yes, it's like a 6-year-old's dream come true. This came out quite a while ago, but I think it is very relevant today. So the first thing I want to share is that it is very clear that misinformation and disinformation, so I'm lumping them together, obviously. One is deliberate and one is unwitting, but they both have the same effect. Misinformation and disinformation pose a clear and present threat. Let me just put it this way. We can say, I don't believe in gravity, but if we step off the cliff, we're still going down. And worse, if we are in a decision-making position in a company, in a city, in a province, at the country level, if we are in a decision-making position and we say, I don't believe in gravity, and we step off the cliff, we're taking a lot of people down with us. And this really is a good analogy for the risk we're confronting today. Now, this disinformation and misinformation is not entirely focused on climate change. In fact, it was fascinating to me when I read the book Denialism over 10 years ago. It doesn't even have a chapter on climate change. And this quote, I think, is very apt. People who can't find North Korea on a map tell you with authority exactly what our policy there should be, says a US writer. So this is not exclusive to climate, but it is rapidly gaining its feet. And climate is one of the primary topics that we see misinformation addressing today. In fact, I saw this cartoon recently, sent it to Catherine this morning when we were talking to each other about this event. And I think it's very apt. You have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and you have number 5 joining them. His name is misinformation. So every year, the World Economic Forum asks business leaders around the world, not academics, not scientists, not even policy experts, business leaders. What are the biggest threats? And over the next 2 years, business leaders identified misinformation and disinformation as the number 1 threat, and extreme weather events as the number 2 threat, and societal polarization as the number 3 threat. These all go together. In fact, whenever there's an extreme weather event, like the flooding in Asheville, North Carolina today, misinformation is rampant. And it is primarily fueled by people on one side of the political spectrum. So all 3 of these things go together. If you look over on the right, you see the planetary issues rising to the top, but you see misinformation and disinformation still there at number 5. So my inputs that I get every day from emails, phone calls, sometimes handwritten letters, and more often than not, social media, are full of misinformation and disinformation. I post about climate change and someone says, oh, it's just a natural cycle. I say that this is a record warm year. We haven't studied this long enough to be sure. You say, we know this, and they say, oh no, you scientists are just making it up. We say that sea level is rising. They say, no, it's falling. We say there are solutions. They say, no, the solutions don't work. And furthermore, they will bankrupt the economy. Misinformation on climate impacts, science, and solutions is rampant online. So it's so rampant that John Cook, who many of you may have heard of, he's a leader in climate and COVID disinformation debunking. He actually teamed up with Steve Lewandowski at Bristol University to create a debunking handbook back in 2011 that they updated a few years ago. And I think they have 4 useful points that they make here that I wanted to highlight. And the first one is simply that this can do some damage. Misinformation can cause substantial harm. And so what you're doing is important. It is essential to protect people against being misinformed by making them resilient against misinformation before it's encountered or by debunking it after they've been exposed, because otherwise we're making decisions based on false information. And those decisions could harm the person making them, but even worse, they could harm all of the people around them. And the more responsibility a person has, the more serious it is when they make decisions based on mis or disinformation. So the second point is that misinformation is very easily propagated with a relatively small effort. This is a brutally difficult task because the giant boulder of misinformation is rolling down the hill at warp speeds with gravity speeding it on its way, and we're trying to stand against it. A famous quote attributed to Mark Twain, although I don't think he actually said it, is that a lie can circle the world while the truth is still getting its boots on. Now, thanks to the internet, a lie can circle the world while the truth is just reaching for its boots. So, for example, when we look at where people fall on the spectrum in terms of their perspectives on climate change, this is the Global Warming 6 Americas for the United States. We don't have one for Canada yet. I think it would actually be, I think someone did work on this. I need to look at and pull that up next time because I feel like I might have seen something for Canada, but Yale officially has only done the US, they've done Ireland, and they've done India. But I don't think we're that different. We would have maybe a bit more over on this side, a bit less on this side. But the point is that people who are truly dismissive, even in the United States, are just 11%. And then in Canada, if I had to guess, I'd probably put that about maybe 7 or 8%. So it's like, as Tony Lazarowitz from the Yale program on climate communication says, he's like, it's like the hair at the end of the tail of the dog is wagging the conversation. It gets worse when we look at the amplification of misinformation on social media. So a study 6 years ago out of MIT found that false information on Twitter diffuses faster, farther, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information. So in other words, there's something about our brain that positively responds to misinformation. It's like we are addicts to false news. So then when COVID hit, a Cornell study identified one person's account as comprising 38% of the information, what they call the infodemic, a term used to refer to the rapid spread of inaccurate information related to the coronavirus. One account, 38%. Then a much more recent study that just came out, although it was using older data, found that 80% of the fake news shared on Twitter during the 2020 US presidential election came from 0.3% of users. 0.3. And this is crazy. These super sharers were disproportionately likely to be older Republican women from Texas, where I live, Florida, and Arizona. And this is really important. It was not bots and it was not automation. To the best of the researchers' knowledge, it was manual and persistent retweeting. So these findings highlight the vulnerability of social media for democracy, where a small group of people distort the political reality for many. Misinformation and disinformation has been weaponized by social media. And just one comment on Twitter, because you see all these studies I just cited were Twitter studies, not X studies. It's because the open API on Twitter got canceled by Musk, so researchers can't use the data anymore on X. But since it moved from Twitter to X, since Musk took over, we have seen a systematic change in the algorithm that has preferentially supported denial accounts. This figure shows the growth in denial accounts after September 2022. It shows the growth in climate accounts, and you see me and Catherine McKenna sort of right there in the middle. Our accounts basically froze and have remained frozen since Musk took over Twitter. And I've even run experiments on X. I took this Canada Day post and I posted it on Threads, Blue Sky, and X. And on X, I have 10 times more followers than I do on Threads or Blue Sky. So I tracked the results and I normalized them by followers. And I found that in terms of the likes and shares, the pink bars, in terms of the comments, the blue bars, Threads and Blue Sky clearly outweighed Twitter. But the comments received on Twitter were 87% negative. And in fact, I got so many of them, over 100 on that one post, that I even analyzed them. So almost half said I'm not a scientist. Then about a fifth said I'm in it for the money or just offered insults. You can see an example of the insults down there. Some of them claimed it was a religion. I love the t-shirt you're wearing there that says I don't believe in climate change. I don't either, because it isn't a religion. Yes. Then they said, it's cold where I live. It's not our fault. You hate the poor, or other random stuff. So these algorithms are even being weaponized to further increase the spread of misinformation, even though they were already set up that way to begin with. In fact, a study by one of my colleagues, Ashley Landrum at Arizona State University, showed that YouTube was primarily responsible for the spread of flat earthism. And a study a number of years ago showed that the algorithm on YouTube was natively set up to radicalize people because that got more clicks and views. So now we have AI. And while there is some positive news, could AI help to quickly detect and debunk false or misleading claims about climate change? It probably could. When people chatted with AI about climate change, did their denial decrease? It did in one experiment. But to be totally honest, I think that the chances of misinformation spreading cheaper or faster than it already does dwarfs the potential positives of what this brings to the conversation. Yet here we are. So we have to make do with what the tools are that we have. And that's why I personally do work with AI, and I'm trying to figure out ways also that we can use it to fight disinformation. It's here to stay. Okay, point number 3. So number 1 is it's a threat. Number 2 is it doesn't take a lot of effort to spread. Number 3, it's really smart. Often when we see quotes from politicians like, you know, for everyone who thinks it's warming, I can find someone who isn't, or alarmist theories on climate science originate with scientists who operate outside the scientific method, says a Christian scientist, we think, well, that's just lack of education. And so often when it comes to misinformation, people still fall for the knowledge deficit model. They still think that if we just give people the right information, they'll change their minds. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And one of the leading researchers in this area over the last decade and a half was Dan Kahan from Yale. And so one of his studies, he said, public apathy is often attributed to a lack of comprehension. People don't know enough science to understand the evidence or to avoid being misled. We conducted a study to test this and found no support for it. Note the date, 12 years ago. In fact, people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned, rather they were most polarized. Larry Hamilton is a researcher at the University of New Hampshire, and he did a study just in New Hampshire alone, which is a really interesting incubator because it has a lot of people of different political parties and persuasions. And he did this analysis at the same time as Dan 12 years ago. And he said, is climate change happening now caused mainly by human activities, yes or no? So he found that with some high school education, Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, and at that time, what they called the Tea Party back 12 years ago, in black, were pretty close together. But the more education people had, the bigger the spread. University graduates, postgraduate education. Dan Kahan redid this for a national study. And he said, is there solid evidence that climate is changing due to human activity like burning fossil fuels? He found a relatively weak positive correlation between something he called ordinary science intelligence, people's ability to parse facts and data and statistics and numbers, going from 0.35 up to 0.6, from the first to the 99th percentile. Then he took this data and he separated it into two groups. Based on what? Level of education? No. Gender? No. Race? No. Politics. And he found that the smarter people were, the better they were at justifying their pre-existing positions. And so he went on to say, and let me translate this into English to save us all time. Being smarter does not make people more accepting of science. It just makes us better to justify or cherry pick what we need to show we're right. This is an identity issue. It is not an education issue. Now, all this research I just showed you was conducted in the United States, but there's been multiple meta-analyses that have extended this to other countries. And I just want to highlight two of them. This top one looked at 56 countries, and they found that climate change beliefs, education, and experience were dwarfed by values, ideologies, and worldviews and political orientation. And the biggest correlation was with political affiliation. And then the second study was even more interesting, in my opinion, because it looked at high versus low income countries. And it found that in high income countries, in rich countries like Canada and the US and Europe, when liberals are more educated, they're more concerned. But when conservatives are more educated, their conservatism attenuates the impact. But what this study found is that in poor countries, no political effect. No political effect. The rich, so the more educated they are, the more they care. So there's a strong correlation with political ideology, and this starts to get at the real problem, which is solution aversion. So people don't really have a problem with lack of information, lack of knowledge or intelligence. The smartest are the most divided. All right, what's my fourth point? Well, misinformation on climate, it began at a specific time and it serves a specific purpose. We've known since the 1850s that digging up and burning coal and gas and oil produces heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. We have been able to measure how much it would warm since Svante Arrhenius calculated the first climate model by hand in the 1890s. And in the 1930s, Guy Callender, who was born in Canada, although he moved to Britain when he was 4, so we'll still claim him. He was born in Canada. He actually observed and published the first record of global temperature showing it had warmed due to burning fossil fuels in 1937. So in 1937, was Guy Callender receiving handwritten letters saying, you're in it for the money and it's just a natural cycle? No. Back in 1990, conservatives and liberals were pretty much neck and neck in terms of their levels of concern about climate change, about 48%. When did denial begin? It didn't begin when Exxon found out about it. They've been studying it for years. It didn't begin when all the big car companies knew about it. They've been studying it for years also, half a century ago. Denial began when climate change moved from a future issue that we don't have to address to a present issue that we do. That's when denial began. Why? Because the purpose of denial is not to question the basic science. It's the same science that explains how stoves heat food and how airplanes fly. And you don't hear a lot of people claiming that they don't heat food or that airplanes don't fly. I mean, there's always somebody claiming something on the internet, but it's not a really big number of people. Denial began when climate change moved from a comfortably future distant issue that didn't have to be addressed to a present issue that did. That's when denial began. And so that shows us that the purpose of denial is not to actually question the science. The purpose is to prevent action. And that is why denial doesn't look consistent. Someone can say, oh, it's a natural cycle. Oh, okay, well, it's actually humans, but more CO2 is good. Oh, well, maybe more CO2 isn't great, but it's too expensive to fix. It's like the whack-a-mole game at the CNE. It doesn't matter which mole pops up. They're going to keep them popping up because the point is to delay action as long as possible. That's the point. We have to keep that in mind when we're addressing misinformation. So back in the 1990s was when this thing moved from a future issue to a heat wave today. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change being signed, the first IPCC report coming out, Jim Hansen testifying to Congress saying global warming was real. And at that time, in the 1990s, who were the richest companies in the world? If you cast your eyes down this list, just about every company on this list, not quite every company, but just about every one, made their money digging up, processing, selling, or making things that burn fossil fuels. And so they took a leaf from the tobacco industry. There was a number of people who had just recently lost their jobs in the tobacco industry, spin doctors. And so as Merchants of Doubt explains, and if you have not read Merchants of Doubt yet, run, do not walk to either watch it or read it. And if you haven't read the petroleum papers yet about Canada, run, do not walk to get that one too, and read the petroleum papers too about Canada. It's horrifying. We're no better at all. So they literally hired people to introduce disinformation. This was deliberate. It was not accidental. It was intelligent, and it was very well funded. All right, on to number 5. I've alluded to this already. What is misinformation in the context of climate change? It is just solution aversion fueled by ideology. I don't want to fix it, so I'm willing to make up whatever crazy reasons I can to avoid it. It could be geoengineering or a secret military experiment or space lasers. People are willing to say anything, no matter how ridiculous, with a straight face, as long as it will get them what they want, which is doing nothing. And what fascinates me is sometimes the mask slips. Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma passed away recently, but he was well known for writing books like The Global Warming Swindle. But in an interview with Rachel Maddow in 2012, he said this. He said, "Do you realize I was actually on your side of this issue," talking about climate change, "when I was chairing that Senate Environment Committee and I first heard about it. I was on your side till when? Till I looked at the science? No, I was on your side until I found out what it would cost to fix it." And now, granted, an Oxford study just last year showed that transitioning to clean energy would save the world $12 trillion by 2050 and more money if we do it faster. But where did his money come from? Oklahoma, oil and gas. And there's no question there's going to be winners and losers, and the losers will be the ones who purvey the fossil fuels that are driving the majority of this problem. I couldn't help taking a screenshot of this. "We're not going to destroy the economy over climate change," says someone with a banner underneath saying millions of Florida homes at risk for climate change. I mean, the irony is just unmistakable. And it really came to the forefront in COVID. So as this essay in The Guardian says, The main issue isn't that people gullibly accept what they're told. They fail to accept the true information. Helpful warnings have gone unheeded. Why is that? Some mistrust towards politicians is understandable, but there's a pattern of mistrust, even among evacuation warnings from Katrina. And what comes out again and again is the importance of what social science researchers call elite cues. So this study from 8 years ago found that elite cues, as well as advocacy efforts and weather extremes, do affect public concern about climate change, but promulgation of accurate scientific information had no effect on public concern. Information-based science advocacy had a minor effect. The biggest impact was what thought leaders were telling people. And today we live in a situation where in the United States, we can't really make this plot for Canada because we have too many different colored areas in Canada. But for the US, this is what the political landscape looked like when I became a climate scientist. This is when I became a climate scientist. The average Democrat was closer to the average Republican than they were to the tails of their own party. And then over time, this happened. And then actually, if they just asked people who voted in the 2017 election, it looked like this. Nowadays, the Beyond Conflict Institute, they've worked in South Africa, they worked in Ireland in the 1970s. These days, they work in the United States. And they found that increasingly, Americans who identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans view one another less as fellow citizens and more as enemies who represent a profound threat to their identity. When this mindset develops, compromise is viewed as weakness or betrayal, and the gain is seen as our loss. I know this is speaking about Americans, but so much of this is leaking north of the border. We have to confront this ourselves too. So I remember seeing this cartoon come out. As long as we just provide the facts to the American people, say the COVID experts, and I very much identified with the climate scientists over there. I was like, yeah, we've been trying that already for 20 years. I could see this thing coming like a train wreck. So just before COVID hit, this was a map of the most, or a figure of the most politically polarized issues in the US. The width of the gray bar indicates how politically polarized an issue is. And already at that time, for 10 years, climate change had been at the top of the list. I put money, well, I didn't literally, but if I could have, I would have. I would have put money on COVID making this list. And this was February 2020. By August 2020, this is what the list looked like. Now, this is not sorted in the order of the gray bars, so I'll just highlight it for you. Here are the biggest gray bars: the Black Lives Matter movement, the COVID outbreak, and climate change. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? The polarization came first. The misinformation feeds it. Let me give you an example from Canada now, because I know I've been showing a lot of US data. This is a survey from 2019 of public opinion in Canada. Do you think the Earth is getting warmer? Well, a thermometer doesn't give you a different answer if you live in Alberta. It is getting warmer. Do you think it's because of human activity? Now we're dipping into the purples. Do you support a carbon tax? Almost the same results. What map is this? This is a map of the election results from the closest year to when the polling data was taken. What's driving people's opinions? It isn't education, it isn't knowledge, it is ideology. So let's move on to number 6. And this is what is so essential to what you do. Misinformation can and must be addressed. But what doesn't work? What have we been trying for years that we really need to give up on? What doesn't work is just thinking that the facts are enough. As George Lakoff writes in this outstanding book, if you haven't read this one, add it to your list also. It's a common folk theory of progressives that the facts set you free. If you can just get all the facts out there in the public eye, every rational person will agree with you, of course. And he goes on to say it's a vain hope. Human brains don't work that way. Framing matters. Once entrenched, they're hard to dispel. Too many progressives have been taught a false and outdated theory of reason. Progressives are constantly giving people facts. When we successfully reframe the public discourse, we change the way the public sees the world. We change what counts as common sense. And saying it right and saying it over and over is advice that can be applied to issue after issue. So in other words, we can do something about it. And it's not, to go back to Calvin, it's not just Susie the scientist loading herself up with all the scientific reports and dumping them. That isn't what's going to work. And on Twitter, before it became X, I posted this and I shared this so many times. I said, I'm not here to argue with dismissives. My definition of a dismissive is somebody who, if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone appeared before them, they would say global warming isn't real. But the good news is that most of us aren't in that category, and there is a secret to tackling this. That's what you're here to do. So what does work? What we know from the debunking handbook is that misinformation can continue to influence people even after it's been debunked. It can be sticky. It's called the continued influence effect. Because it's sticky, it's best to be preempted. Inoculation in advance is really important, like with a virus. Inoculation from misinformation. But if we can't do that, then we have to provide a clear and repeated explanation of not only why it's false, but you have to replace it with something that works and makes sense. Nature abhors a vacuum. You can't leave a vacuum. You got to fill it with something. So we tried this with Republicans. We created 4 short videos taking Republican perspectives on climate change, national security, free market, personal liberty, and I did a faith-based video. And when the researchers used these videos on social media, they found that people's opinions on, is it real? Am I worried? Will it affect me? They increased, but guess which political party increased the most? Republicans, almost twice as much. They went on to say, is it human caused? Is it important? Will it affect future generations? Look at these numbers. Like, let's just take the is it important one in the middle. Democrats went from 94 to 97% after seeing the videos. Republicans went from 39 to 50% after seeing a 1-minute video that framed things in their perspective from a value that they already had. This is so powerful. So what do we have to do? We have to help people connect their head to their heart. Why does this matter here? And why does this matter now? We have to help them connect what they already care about to what this is. And that's unfortunately getting easier and easier these days. But we have to address solution aversion. We have to show people that there are solutions that are viable, that are already being implemented today. The biggest thing we lack is efficacy. If people understand that what they do can make a difference, most people are willing to act. We have a stunning lack of efficacy in Canada and in the US. This is a survey by country showing that, do you think that I could be doing more? Do you think that we could be doing more? And I'm really sorry to say Canada is not on this YouGov study, which I think is a terrible lack. But you can see that the pinks are all on this side. And in the US itself, 50% of people don't know what to do. And most people in most countries think the most effective thing to do is recycle. There is a huge gap in information on solutions, the hands, and on why it matters, the heart. I'm not talking about polar bears. I'm not talking about global temperature. I'm talking what is happening where we live today to things that I care about and what real solutions can and are being implemented today. So that's why I take all this social science and I apply it every single week in my newsletter. I share good news to help the hands get going. I share not so good news to help people engage their hearts. And I share something people can do to make a difference. Because I'm truly convinced that what we talk about matters and we can make a difference. And this is my last point. This is a fight for our future. Make no mistake. The Stanford Internet Observatory, which is very similar to what you're working on here, it was shut down this past June because those who purvey and spread misinformation to increase political polarization view truth as their enemy. So stand strong, be prepared for opposition. In fact, to be totally honest, the amount of the opposition we receive is often directly proportional to how effective we're being. Keep your eye on the final goal. This is what's at stake: a livable future for all of us and all of our kids, and that is why we cannot afford to give up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe. I don't know how much you can see of the room, but certainly there's a big wow factor that's percolated through this room. It was a provocative presentation, for sure. What came out for me was you addressed the roots, the drivers, the impact, how this debate is polarized, and how mis and disinformation wedges that polarization to make it work. And then the balance between inoculation and intervention as mis and disinformation laboratories like ourselves seek solutions going forward. We do have some time for Q&A with Dr. Hayhoe. There is a microphone at the side of the room, or if you just raise your hand and I'll make sure that you're acknowledged. Yes, the Honorable Catherine McKenna.
Catherine, you're awesome, as always. Actually, I learned a ton there too. Maybe you could just talk, because a lot of this was more general, and I think it's very useful, but maybe you could talk about the Canadian context, because I know you've had a look at it. So when we talk about the sources of misinformation and disinformation, can you maybe unpack a bit of what you have seen and what the facts and the evidence show?
Absolutely. I did focus more on a general perspective because this is a global issue. And how it plays out in Canada has some specifics to our country, our geography, our politics, and our economy. But it's very much mirroring what's going on in other places around the world. So I think it's really helpful to keep that perspective. So in terms of the types of misinformation we see in Canada, we often see things like, oh, we're a cold country, so why does global warming matter? But we also have an economy that is disproportionately tied to the industry that is primarily responsible for this problem. So the contribution of the oil and gas economy to our overall national economy is relatively large. Norway is another country that's very similar to Canada in this regards. So we have a population that most people in Canada are quite worried about climate change. I think the latest numbers are about 3/4 of us are worried about climate change. But most of us don't know what to do. And there's a strong financial incentive in certain parts of the country to take advantage of the fact that many people, they just want to feed their families. They just want a good job. And so taking advantage of that and really polarizing and demonizing people helps drive these wedge between us. And I've seen this, of course, this wedge is being driven between families even, as well as between people who know each other. So when we have these conversations, I feel like it's super helpful to start at the top with what we do agree on, rather than at the bottom with what we don't. And what we do agree on is we want a better future. We're worried about the changes that we're seeing happening in our cities and our towns. We've seen flooding. We've seen extreme heat. We've seen hurricanes hit the Maritimes. Our entire country was blanketed with wildfire smoke from the East Coast to the West Coast last summer in a way that none of us have ever seen. And we don't have the two parties. We have a bit more of a spread out spectrum of parties, but we see a strong political polarization, like I showed in those maps, to where on the conservative side, compared to on the more liberal side, there is much less interest in addressing this issue and much greater interest in supporting and promoting the spread of misinformation. So in Canada, and Catherine, I'd love your perspective on this, but I feel like we have really missed the boat on the opportunity to communicate the heart and the hands. I just don't see in Canada a lot of the inoculation going on in terms of helping people understand how climate change is already affecting you here and now, and how policies like our carbon pricing are actually helping not just cities and provinces in the country, but helping individual people as well through the carbon refund and through all the incentives that are available. What difference is it making? Because if people feel like we have this policy, but it's not making a difference, then people won't support it. But if they understand why it's a difference, where are the posters of John and Nancy from Sarnia in the bus stop talking about the rebate that they got and how they used it to, insulate their homes so their power bills dropped? Like, where is this communication? Where is the inoculation effect? We have not had that, and we have so much to draw on. In many cases, the fruit is so low hanging for us in Canada, it is rotting on the ground in terms of what we could be doing to move the needle. So when you deal with disinformation and misinformation, don't forget that preventing it in the first place by inoculating people with facts and truth is incredibly powerful. And there's so much that could be done. We have these tools, many of which I talked about have been used for bad, but we can use those tools too for good. And I think there's a lot of potential, like that Yale study I did with the Republican videos. There is so much potential to move the needle. Catherine, what would you add to that? Is there anything you'd add about the Canadian context specifically that you were thinking about that I didn't mention?
You and I can take this offline.
How long do you have?
Sure, in the center, Oh, sorry. In the center there first, yeah.
Hi. So a lot of useful policy that is often like attempted to be created or is about to be voted into effect can be stopped by lobbying and corrupt politicians. Do you believe that if we cracked down on lobbying and corruption that we would see more positive policy come into effect?
I think there's no question about that. And of course, in the US, that's even more rampant than in Canada. There's been analysis that have tracked fossil fuel funding and what national representatives, including Congress people and senators, propose and vote for. I mean, the lines are extremely clear that there's a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and that is massively skewing our policies and our economy. So just to give you one example, globally, fossil fuels are subsidized to the tune of $7 trillion per year, US. And last year, the big oil majors made record profits, the biggest profits they've ever made, and fossil fuel subsidies increased. That is a classic example of the influence of power and money in policies that just don't make sense.
We had a question over here. It'd be helpful if you introduce yourself, if you could. Right near the pillar. So I don't know your name. Oh, didn't you put up your name? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh dear. Over here then. Yep.
So thanks for noticing my t-shirt. My name is Norm Leo. I've been a climate communicator for the past 20 years. And this t-shirt is actually to start conversations. So in the back, it's written, I don't believe in climate change. In the front, it's written, I accept the evidence of climate change. So it's not a question of belief, and I think you know that. You said earlier that the Yale climate communication, the global warming 6 Americas, the equivalent in Canada is called the PARCA study. PARCA, P-A-R-C-A, if ever someone wants to check that out. You can find some data there. The other thing, the more information doesn't convince people, but what I've seen in communication that does make the ball rolling is selling the co-benefits of climate action. So talking about, saving money when you insulate the house, talking about getting more fit when you go to work on your bike, or there are so many other benefits. So selling those co-benefits to climate action can really, I think, sway people. Plus all of the wonderful things you said. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Norm. It's nice to see you in person. Let me clarify this because this is a really important point. I did not say that more information doesn't make a difference. I said the right type of information does. And so here's the thing. For decades, we've been assuming more information about how the ocean currents are slowing, or global temperature is hitting record highs, or the polar bears are starving. We've been assuming that that information is what makes a difference. And what the social science has been showing is that the doom and gloom headlines, and this is actually a direct quote from a meta-analysis that came out in May, doom and gloom gets the most clicks and shares on social media, and it is the most useful for information sharing, but is the worst at catalyzing action. So I think of that as the head. All of that is up here in the head. What does catalyze action, the information that inoculates people and catalyzes action, is knowing the heart and the hands. So how climate change is affecting me here in ways that matter, whether it's my kids or my garden or my work or my supply chain or my whatever it is. And then information, like you just said, on what solutions look like, on how I can make a difference. And so that's why every week I run that experiment through my newsletter where I share why climate change matters to our heart and what solutions look like in terms of our hands and what people can do to help get the ball moving. I firmly believe information makes a difference, but it has to be the right kind of information. And that is where we have a massive vacuum that, like I said, the fruit is so low, it's lying on the ground rotting. We have such an opportunity to move the needle and make a difference. And that study where we framed climate concerns and climate solutions in Republican terms, and Republican opinion changed 2 to 3 times more than Democrat opinions, that showed the potential. If we can just reframe things around the heart and the hands, there's huge potential to move the needle and to inoculate people. Thank you.
And a question, center table.
Hi, thank you, Catherine. Very interesting talk. I'm David Parry. You started to answer my question just now, so it's extending it a little further. You made a very strong point about how ideology was absolutely central. So I'm still wondering what it looks like, okay, heart and hands, but it sounds like you're also saying you have to be attending to the ideology of your audience. So what does that look like in terms of conveying messages that somehow are spoken in the language of the audience in order to get their attention? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. That is so near and dear to my heart. So often we assume, and remember when I was talking about George Lakoff, we sort of assume the truth is self-evident. If we just tell people the facts, everybody will be like, oh, of course. We internally don't even, or subconsciously, there's reasons why we care. And we just subconsciously assume everybody will care for the same reasons we do. So let me give you a very obvious example. Imagine if the reason I cared about climate change so passionately was because I was a birder. And we know that birds are shifting northward and they're even becoming extinct. Imagine if I felt everybody had to become a birder first before they could care about climate change. That'd be ridiculous. I am a winter sports enthusiast. Imagine if we had to teach everybody to skate and ski before they could care about climate change. That would be ridiculous. But often we we subconsciously impose that barrier because when we're trying to communicate from the heart, we're communicating from our heart rather than the other person's heart. So if we really want to be effective, we have to help them see who they already are as the perfect person to care. So let me give you 2 examples. When I wrote my book, Saving Us, a couple of years ago, and I had to record the audio version over the long weekend. So I went into the audio studio in Lubbock, Texas, second most conservative city in the US, where I've been living for the last 12 years. And there was one audio engineer there. And so I started to record the book. I read the first few chapters. I went out to take a break and rest my voice. And the audio engineer said, I didn't realize your book was about climate change. I have some questions. And I was like, oh, no. But I was like, okay, I can't not, I'm writing this whole book about how we can have conversations about climate change. I got to do this. So I started, though, not with telling him anything. I started by asking him questions. How long have you lived here? Do you have family? Yes, children and grandchildren. What did you enjoy doing growing up? What do you do now with your grandchildren today? pretty soon, this guy was telling me about how he grew up fishing, but now when he goes there, the lake is too warm and it's choked with algae. How he grew up skiing just over the border in New Mexico, but now the Christmas season's really dodgy because they don't get enough snow. Pretty soon, he was telling me why he cared about climate change and how it affected his children and his grandchildren. And so when we got to the end of that, I said, well, you know, this is happening all across the US and it's happening all around the world. And he looked at me and he said, well, I'm a Republican. What can we do about it? So we had already gone all through the heart and he totally got it. He just wanted to know what he could do. And so then I could tell him about Bob Inglis, a two-time Republican congressman from South Carolina who has a Climate Solutions Institute. And I could tell him about all of that. But people's hearts are there. So last week I was on one of my bundled trips. I do most of my talks virtually, 90%. And when I do travel, I bundle. So I was on a trip where I did 31 events in 12 days because I want to make every little gram of carbon count. And the last event was speaking to a Congress of 10,000 Christian leaders from around the world in Seoul, Korea, and who represent 600 million Protestant Christians around the world. And after years of trying, we finally got a plenary stage position to talk about climate change at this meeting. So what did I do? Did I whip out the IPCC reports? No. My presentation was, in fact, I think pretty much the only words I had on the screen for my presentation were Bible verses. Why? Because that was the audience. So I wanted to make sure that it was what they were already, you know, on board and familiar with, what their central values were. So we can do this. You know, I've started conversations over a shared love of knitting or food or beach vacations, or I helped co-found Science Moms. That's all about mothers caring about the future of their kids. You know, I'm not a hunter, I don't fish, so I'm not the person to have conversations with people who care about that, but there's other people who do. So framing it around what people care about already is so important, because otherwise we're setting up an invisible barrier that you must care about X first before you care about climate change. We got to get rid of that invisible barrier. We got to show them how who they already are, even if they're conservative politically, is the perfect person to care about climate change. And I believe that we can do that with just about everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe. I know there's more questions that people want to pose. Unfortunately, Dr. Hayhoe's on a tight schedule, and we have to respect that. There will be more time for discussion following our panel, though. But please join me in really enthusiastically recognizing that powerful speech. Dr. Hayhoe, we learned much about not only mis and disinformation, not just about how that relates to climate change, but importantly, how we can powerfully communicate, including to those who are skeptical and are probably the ones that we should be communicating the most with. So thank you so much for your powerful words, and hope you can continue to collaborate with us as we move forward on our journey. So we are shifting gears now. We're not going to be taking a break in the room. There are refreshments, so you can take a break at your own pleasure. We are going to be starting another panel of where we can sort of do a deeper dive on two of the themes that have come out, including, you know, how do we communicate science in an age of disinformation, and what is the impact of disinformation on climate change action. So I'm going to introduce our four panelists, and then I'm going to introduce our moderator, and I'd ask the panelists to please come up to the chairs at the front. So Senior Fellow Helen Hayes is of the McGill Center for Media, Technology and Democracy. McGill's been a great partner for us in mis and disinformation. They have a great facility there. We've already had Angus Brigman and others engage with us, and she's going to address climate delayism narratives. Dr. Daniel Stockmeyer of the University of Ottawa is going to be addressing how to understand climate change conspiracy beliefs. We'll also look at information integrity through two case studies. Dr. Patrick McCurdy of the University of Ottawa will speak to corporate net zero narratives. And Dr. Chris Russell at the end of Carleton University. Yes, we still love Carleton, even though we're from the University of Ottawa. They're welcome here. We have had them before. So we're very pleased that he is here because he's also from the Reclimate folk at Carleton who are doing excellent work. And he will speak to misinformation with respect to climate and wildfires. But we're so privileged to have as our event moderator for this session, the Honorable Catherine McKenna. She is the founder and CEO of Climate and Nature Solutions, a former Minister of Environment and Climate Change, as well as a Minister for Infrastructure. And as a member of the Lab's Advisory Council, she has been very supportive and encouraging of our work here at the university. She'll make some opening remarks and also moderate discussion after the panelist presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. It's great to be here. Merci, Serge. Also, Eric Saint-Pierre, mon ami. It's great that you're helping to fund this. And it's great to be here at the University of Ottawa. I mean, I'm also thrilled that Katharine Hayhoe, who is my good friend, we are allies on climate, and often we talk about, we see who has the worst trolls in a particular moment in time. But I think she did a really awesome job. I have my phone here. You might be wondering, one, because Katharine said some really interesting things we might pick up on, but we also are going to try to stay to schedule. So I'm not going to say a lot. One thing that I am also doing that's probably most relevant to the discussion today is I am chair of the UN Secretary General's expert group on net zero. It's extremely long title that is incomprehensible, like everything in climate change. So back to, we could talk like normal people. But it's really to set criteria and standards for net zero commitments by corporates, financial institutions, cities, and regions. And it was really interesting because I left politics. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was just like, oh, peace out. This has been great, but I got to work on climate globally and my 3 kids post-COVID. And the Secretary General asked me to lead this expert group. And it was really interesting because I'd focus on a lot of different things in my different positions, but I had not specifically focused on net zero. And what I loved about it is this is actually totally measurable. So if you hear anyone say, oh, well, we don't understand what's going on, it's hard to do, but it's not hard to measure. So I'll do this. I'll use my hands. This is how easy it is. So when you say you're net zero, and you can do this test because sometimes people fail like just on this test, and it's there are 10 recommendations. I work in 3 and 10s. And it's obviously, there are more details, but essentially this is what needs to happen. Your emissions need to go down along with the science, and your money needs to go from dirty to clean, and you need to think of people at the bottom. So that's what it is. So if anyone says to you, I'm net zero, you can just think, are your emissions going down, oil and gas? No, so you're not net zero, just on like the very, very basic. You don't have to go through the full analysis of their interim targets, long-term targets, where their money's going. You don't have to do any of that. And I say this because I think it is really important what is being done here. Serge, Jennifer, and everyone that's associated with the Climate Misinformation, Disinformation Lab, although I guess it's a broader lab. But it is so incredibly important that we be very objective and very disciplined, because what I saw in my time in government was kind of shocking. I was just like a regular person from Hamilton, Ontario, who decided like we needed a change in government. So I said, like, we need women to step up too, and I've got the opportunity to step up. I don't know if anyone was in Ottawa Centre, but we worked for 2 years. Yes, Ottawa Centre is the best. Worked for 2 years with a team, my amazing team. And I got elected. And then I was put in this position to do environment and climate change. And I literally fell off the chair when the Prime Minister asked me, because I was like, no, there are people who go to all those conferences every year. I don't even know what like COP is. And I literally had to ask my, I don't know, my chief of staff or deputy minister. I was like, no dumb questions, right? And they're like, right? They're like, right. And so then I said, well, what's a COP? And they were like, Conference of the Parties. And I was like, that is the stupidest acronym. It is not actually descriptive. I mean, I guess it's descriptive of people meet, parties meet, but so I banned acronyms. But I got into this, and in fact, I thought social media was great. Like, I was like totally into it. I'd run a charity. That was my only way to, when I was in a campaign, no one was paying any attention to us. And so I was like out there, and suddenly it became terrible and negative, which was a problem, obviously, but the disinformation was extreme. And that makes it a lot harder. Like, why do we care so much about it? It's not just because it's bad. It's not just because like it's hateful often and there's misogyny hits climate denial in this really weird way. It's because it stops action. It makes it way harder to do things. And we're actually seeing levels, and it depends what you're looking at, but actually the level of belief that climate change is real and man-made is going down, including in Canada. This is an extremely worrying phenomena. So I think this is a hugely critical, important topic. And the problem is sometimes people get scared about it because it has to do with political polarization. I think we just have to be neutral on that. We have to be like, misinformation, disinformation is a thing. And so we're just going to apply. We're going to be like, you know, academics, or not an academic, I'm more a practitioner, but we're just going to be disciplined on just looking at what's happening and looking at ways that we can, you know, address it, both in terms of people's understanding, but also stopping it. Now, that might be a big Herculean task, so as we know. So Elon Musk, our #1 propagator now of climate disinformation with his algorithms. It's great to hear that his algorithms are working really well on Catherine and me and making sure that we get less reach. So thank you, Elon. But I mean, I think that we've got a really smart group here that have looked at, you know, disinformation and misinformation in different ways. And I think we need to learn, but then most importantly, we need to act. And we don't have time because the climate crisis obviously is getting worse. So with that, I'm going to, I guess, take this mic with me. So let me start that. Do people need these? Are there any PowerPoints? Yes, okay, I'm bringing this over too. All right, so we're gonna have 2 presentations that are, so the deal is we have presentations that are 10 minutes long, and we're pretty tough on that. And then we will go into open discussion. I might start with a question, but if there's like tons of interest, I won't bother. And I think we're going to follow the first 2 presentations are going to talk about what we are seeing in climate misinformation, disinformation. And the second one too might be sort of that, but also just looking at case studies. So with that, we have Senior Fellow Helen Hayes. So she's at the McGill Center for Media Technology and Democracy, talking about climate delayism and narratives.
Is it working? Yeah, there we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Catherine. Today I'm going to be presenting a report that's forthcoming from the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, which is a research organization housed at the Maxwell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And I'm a senior fellow at the center. So in the presentation, I'm going to be sharing some findings from a national survey that we conducted at the center that tracked the state and spread of climate delay narratives in Canada and their impact on people's understandings and preferences for climate action. While we find that Canadians largely believe in the anthropogenic nature of climate change and the need for climate action in response, variations emerge as Canadians evaluate their beliefs on appropriate climate solutions and the nature of the impact of climate change itself. So in particular, as I mentioned, we look at different narratives that surround climate change in Canada and what the public demand and reception for those narratives are. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so in recent years, we've found that discourse around climate change in Canada has shifted from one of denial to delay as the public becomes more accepting of the realities of climate change. So while we use climate delay and obstructionism interchangeably in our report, what this exemplifies is a shift in climate change discourse that focuses on the inevitability of climate change, framing extractive practices as green, appealing to free market logic, and focusing on the ineffectivity of solutions with the ultimate goal of delaying and slowing down climate change solutions. So because of this move to delay narratives, we often focus on the social effects of climate policy or the effectiveness of solutions. And these narratives can draw on aspects of Canadian politics and societal cleavages. For example, we see ties of these narratives to petrocultures, oil and gas nationalism, and the affordability crisis. Okay, so the demand in public reception and salience of climate change narratives remains understudied. So we sought to fill that research gap to consider how climate delay is intertwined with and impacts public behavior in Canada. And specifically with this report, we aimed to link our work at the Center on Platform Governance and Online Harms to climate issues in the country. So this led us to explore how climate obstruction or climate delay narratives spread on social media platforms, and to think about how platforms might work to actually reduce the spread of this false or misleading content. So our methodology, we took a survey of 2,200 Canadian citizens that were aged 18 and over, fielded between the 4th and 12th of January of 2024. And our sample included a representative group of Canadians according to gender, age, and province. The survey was specifically designed to capture Canadians' public response to climate delay narratives, particularly the following 5: hypocrisy and elitism, which argues that global elites, including politicians and other government officials, are hypocritical in their calls to address climate action because of their own environmentally damaging actions and behaviors. Secondly, absolutionism, which argues for the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which states that while all countries are accountable for addressing climate change, the burden doesn't apply equally. Then unreliable renewables, self-explanatory. Indigenous involvement, which challenges the conventional association of Indigenous groups with opposition to extraction. And ethical oil, which argues that Canadian oil is ethically produced and governed. And then additionally, we added one interesting question for our case, which was about financial insecurity and how financial insecurity might impact climate change behavior in Canada. So we wanted to measure economic well-being to test if financial insecurity impacted people's attitudes towards climate change. So our key findings here, and I'll dig a bit deeper into these shortly, were that a majority of respondents agree with at least some climate change delay narratives, which demonstrates both the supply and demand for climate change delay discourse. Individuals are more likely to prefer corporate and government responsibility for climate action over individual action. We connect this to factors like personal impact and economic security. While 75% of respondents agree that climate change is real, less than 50% of respondents believe that they are currently impacted by climate change. So this impact gap describes how individuals perceive climate change, often associated with major disaster events. Interestingly, too, respondents can adopt competing frames. So while acknowledging the harms of oil and gas, they still associate oil and gas with both individual financial stability and the country's financial well-being. And lastly, what's interesting for our research on democracy is that climate skepticism is evident across the partisan landscape. Okay, so our research on the narrative. So overall, we find that more than half of respondents in general agree with established climate change delay narratives. So there's substantial demand and belief of those narratives. Particularly with hypocrisy and elitism, around 50% of respondents agree with the statement that climate delegates using their wealth to partake in individual actions contribute to negative effects of climate change, like taking private jets to COP, for example. Respondents presented with hypocrisy and elitism narratives in the survey perceived Canada as having a slower energy transition because of institutional and elite hypocrisy. Absolutionism focuses on comparative blame avoidance and buck passing, for example, to other countries to alleviate domestic criticism of extractivist activities. So while respondents viewed Canada's energy transition as relatively slow, The absolutism framework also shifts perception. So respondents exposed to this narrative in the survey still perceive Canada's energy transition to be faster than the control group, which perceived a much slower transition. And lastly, in Canada, the unreliable renewables rhetoric is used to portray wind and solar as threatening Canadian energy security due to their scarcity and high cost. Interestingly, the most notable agreement amongst all of our tested narratives belonged to unreliable renewables, surpassing 62.5% of agreeable responses. Now, continuing on with narratives, our survey findings demonstrated the effectiveness of the Indigenous support and empowerment narrative, with over 50% of respondents agreeing that the oil and gas industry empowers Indigenous communities through economic benefits and providing job opportunities. And our survey results also suggest that the ethical oil narrative has been effective at influencing the Canadian public opinion, carrying around 50% of support among responses. This, of course, further showcases that respondents don't need firsthand experience or closeness to the topic in order to have a strong perception that Canada sets an example for ethical oil practices around the world. Now, moving on to some topics similar to what Catherine spoke about earlier this afternoon, responsibility of climate action. So moving away from narrative perceptions, our survey also examined Canadians' beliefs about climate action responsibility. So respondents on average are more likely to agree with climate action taken at the government and corporate level rather than through individualized actions. So survey respondents were asked if they agreed with various individual actions that they could take to address climate change, including, for example, driving an electric vehicle, voting for a pro-climate action politician, attending pro-climate action protests, flying less, eating less meat. And on average, survey respondents agreed that individual responsibility and action must be taken to address climate change. Around 50% of individuals strongly or somewhat agreed with that. More than 50% of respondents on average strongly or somewhat agree with presented options for corporate climate action, and individuals favored the use of energy efficient technology by corporations, with over 75% of respondents indicating that they somewhat or strongly agree. Now, going back to the climate impact gap I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, despite increasing belief in the effects and anthropogenic nature of climate change, less than 50% of our survey respondents strongly or somewhat agree that they're currently being personally impacted by climate change. So respondents are more likely to believe that they'll be impacted by climate change in the future, or that other people are more likely to be impacted than they currently are. In contrast, people who disagree that they have personally experienced the effects of climate change are thus particularly resistant to individual level climate solutions. Onto the climate gap, 9% of total respondents indicated that they don't feel the impact of climate change and don't anticipate that they'll feel it in the future. However, 24% of that 9% still believe in climate change, which is interesting. This margin represents the impact gap population, where individuals may believe in the anthropogenic nature of climate change, yet may be misguided or misunderstand what climate impact on daily lives may actually resemble. Climate change narratives that obfuscate the links between environmental, socio-political, or even economic affairs can thus widen the impact gap, where individuals don't associate adverse events as caused by climate change. I will speed up. Yeah. Just moving along quickly, financial scarcity mindset is not present amongst respondents. While 50% of respondents believe that climate change will impact economic stability, it doesn't actually factor substantially in their preferences for climate solutions. And this is my last slide, I believe, or almost my last slide. While survey respondents are largely pro-climate action, particularly at the government and corporate level, results suggested hesitancy around climate action that would have perceived immediate repercussions on financial stability. Now, my last point is about the partisan landscape here. So survey respondents were asked for their partisanship in the survey at the federal level. Conservatives are more likely than liberal or NDP partisans to believe that the federal government should support the energy sector, including building oil pipelines. And conservatives are also more likely to support energy efficient technologies than to support buying carbon offsets and divesting from oil and gas as a form of corporate climate action. And then just to end on some implications, while our report is largely solution agnostic, respondents demonstrate a preference for corporate and government climate actions. So it's clear that policymakers must consider these preferences in how they develop and present climate solutions in the Canadian context. Thanks.
That was great. Very interesting. A lot to unpack there. Now we're going to go to Dr. Daniel Stockmeyer, who is going to talk about understanding climate change conspiracy beliefs and looking at Canada in a comparative perspective.
So I'm just waiting for them. So I stand down. I cannot really sit and talk, so sorry. I'm presenting some work that's co-authored with one of my PhD students. It's entitled Understanding Climate Change Conspiracy Belief, a Canadian Comparative Outlook. So the study we did was across 8 countries, but in the presentation I focus mainly on Canada. So very quickly, just to define that we're all on the same page, what a conspiracy theory is. So we use a recent definition by Douglas and Sutton. And the conspiracy theory is a belief that 2 or more actors have coordinated in secret to achieve an outcome, and that their conspiracy is of public interest, but not of public knowledge. And there are a lot of climate change conspiracy theories floating around, and they range from the simple idea that climate change is a hoax, and accusations of scientific bias and fraud, we've heard this before in the keynote, to elaborate plots that the government is manipulating the weather, so advanced geoengineering, and that influential elites invented global warming as part of a sinister plot to create a new world order. And throughout this research, we use a relatively simple definition that's applicable to the 8 cases we study. And we basically ask survey respondents, do you agree that climate change is a hoax and scientists touting its experience are lying? So we have 2 research questions. One is, how prevalent are beliefs in climate change conspiracy theories in Canada and around the world? And what are the determinants of climate change conspiracy theories, looking at the demand side, looking at the individual factors that contribute to people believing in climate change conspiracies? Quickly about the data and method. So this is based on our own data set. We collected it about 1.5 years ago. And the sample consisted of 1,000 people from 8 countries: Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Lebanon, Morocco, South Africa, United States. The idea was to also have 4 Western countries and 4 non-Western countries. I focus mainly in the results section on Canada. And the survey is roughly representative of the country's population. We have a couple explanatory variables. So to explain individual constituents or individual factors that contribute to beliefs in conspiracy theories, we look at age. The idea it could be either younger or older ones, gender. Traditionally, men have been more likely to believe in conspiracy or climate change conspiracy. Education, even if it was debunked, but there's still some, our keynote, there's still some literature that says more educated people are less likely to believe in climate change conspiracies. Place of residency, with rural people being more likely. Immigrant status depends on the country. Socioeconomic status also depends a little bit on the country. Then political ideology, the idea that people on the extremes, especially on the far right, are more likely to believe in climate change conspiracy theories. Trust in scientists, and the idea is people who don't trust in scientists also don't trust in the idea that climate change is human-made. And then populist attitudes, and there's also should be a strong connections, because populist actors are mainly the ones who fuel, or a strong actor who fuel these conspiracies. So the results, and here it's just some descriptive statistics. So we distinguish people who agree with the statement that climate change is a hoax, people who disagree, and people who don't know or are uncertain. And we see Canada, the third column, 15% either strongly agree or agree. It's about half and half. It's strongly agree or agree. So I clustered them here together. 70%, 60% disagree. And what I find very interesting, not only for Canada, but for every country, there's a lot of people who don't know or don't want to say if they agree or not. It's in Canada 25%, and it can range even in the non-Western countries to close to 50%. So this is a group maybe we want to look more closely. Also a group we can reach with maybe some kind of advocacy. And now looking at the factors that contribute, these are what's called standardized coefficients. So they show us basically relative to the other coefficients, the effect of any of these variables. And for ideology, we see that right-wing people are more likely, what we expect, to believe in climate change conspiracies, people with populist attitudes. And then on the other side, people who trust in scientists are less likely. And this was relatively surprising. And these are basically the results for Canada. It's not for the whole world. These are the regression results for Canada. Older people are less likely. So especially young people, I think that's also a take-home point, are more likely to believe in the idea that climate change is a hoax. And then in the middle, like socioeconomic status, very little impact, gender, no impact, immigrant status, very little impact, also education, that also corroborates the findings from the keynote, very little effect, and place of residency, very little effect. And these results remain more or less consistent if we look at the Western countries, the 4 Western countries we have. If we look beyond the Western world, let's say Morocco, Lebanon, we get some different results. For example, ideology loses its impact. So to summarize, so 4 factors in Canada increase a person's likelihood to believe in climate change conspiracy beliefs. These are right-wing ideology, populist attitudes, distrust in scientists, and youth. And so to discussion, to conclude, climate change conspiracy beliefs are quite widespread. In Canada, less so than other countries. Of the 8 countries, there was only Germany that was less. Then, I don't know, there's still high levels of lack of knowledge or uncertainty. Otherwise, how could we explain the 25% are in this middle category? And we can draw, based on this research, a clear picture of the typical believer in conspiracy beliefs. As such a person is rather young, safe places himself on the right on the ideological scale, distrusts scientists and embraces populist attitudes. And interestingly, factors such as socioeconomic status or education seem to have little impact in explaining variation in climate change conspiracy beliefs. I think I was under 10 minutes. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That was great. Gold star for staying under time. I mean, it's interesting, the youth thing, that is worrying to me. That is really worrying. Like, we're going in the wrong direction on that. Okay, we're now going to Dr. Patrick McCurdy, and going to talk about something that is close to my heart, net zero narratives, corporate claims versus climate reality, and I guess a lot of greenwashing, maybe.
Oh, no, the screen has, oh no. There we go. Excellent, okay, thanks. So we'll start the clock now, I guess, right? Typical academic on my, looking at timing. I'll go to this slide, actually, next one. There we are, just because it's got a QR code for the article that I'm going to be talking about. So you can Google it, or you can scan the QR code to get the article. It takes you right there. I've been studying the narrative claims of oil sands companies for about the past decade or so, but it really has been my work with Chris Russell and Melissa Ronchek that's had me sort of focus in on greenwashing in the context of the fossil fuel industry. And so up front, I want to acknowledge this it's a co-authored paper done with Chris and Melissa, who's not here, and we're continuing on this work as part of a SHIRK project into greenwashing. This piece was published in June of this year, published open source in the journal Energy Research and Social Science. And the examples that I'll talk about are in this paper, and there's a bunch of other stuff that we won't have time to talk about, more examples, more work there as well. So a bit of context, and we've heard some of this already, but oil companies both bank on and make bank on social license. 2003 marked their second most profitable year ever in the last decade, just behind 2023, just behind 2022. As many of you know, and as was said earlier, the oil industry is Canada's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, coming in at 1/3, 31% of emissions. And it is actually one of the only, or if not the only major source of Canada's emissions that continues to grow. According to Pembina's Waiting to Launch report, which was published just about 2 weeks ago, oil sands emissions have increased by 142% since 2005. However, you probably wouldn't get this impression from the oil sands industry's messaging. Until June of this year, the Pathways Alliance, who essentially represents 95% of Alberta's upstream oil industry, ran various net zero ad campaigns. This was part of a larger influence and communications campaign to convince Canadians to help foot the bill for its CCS project. And while the full price tag of the project was rarely disclosed, in our work, we found the project total cost was estimated to be about $75 billion, with estimates being that the Canadian public, us, would be asked to front up to $50 billion and pay for that ourselves. In fact, we found in our research often the numbers used and disclosed by Pathways were vague, selectively disclosed, and part of a wider pattern of greenwashing. So we can look to define greenwashing. Here we go. And again, we talked about, even before this panel started, we talked about the link between misinformation, disinformation, where does greenwashing fit, something we can come back to. But to have an academic starting point of definition, we can define it as the dissemination of false or deceptive information regarding an organization's environmental strategies, goals, motivations, and actions. Greenwashing can be intentional or unintentional, and claims can be verbal, written, photographs, moving images, the use of color, these types of things. The article that we quote from on screen, published in the journal Sustainability, provides an excellent and detailed framework of various claim types. We've talked already about how mis and disinformation can sort of cause issues with public trust. Greenwashing is no different, creating a false sense of progress while delaying and undermining effective climate actions. In the case of oil and gas, it can harm energy transition efforts, ultimately worsening the climate crisis through the continued burning of fossil fuels. Next slide here. So this is something like I said, I've looked at for a while, and public messaging and ad campaigns are key assets that can influence public opinion and retain a social mandate to extract and burn fossil fuels. Oil and gas companies and their boosters have tried various narratives over time. We've seen already discussed today patriotic and ethical narratives, some of which have recently come back into fashion. And this actually connects very much with the heart and hand narratives that Katharine Hayhoe mentioned earlier, but is being used by oil companies and boosters. We've seen adversarial narratives, and we also now see the sort of pragmatic or collaborative narratives. In the case of the Pathways Alliance, their goal is to rebrand as a reliable partner in energy transition efforts. But as we show in our article, Pathways must be seen as a lobbying organization and as a promotional organization whose objective is to extract subsidies while maintaining business as usual. Next slide here. There we go. So if you go far enough back in time, you can see some of these narratives repeat themselves. The climate crisis has worsened, but some of the greenwashing tropes remain the same. You can look at the similarities between an image from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, in 2010, and Pathways in 2023. You can think about the use of color. The color blue evokes cleanliness, transparency, and trust, white for purity and innocence. Natural images of blue skies and clouds help create the perception of environmental stewardship, friendliness, responsibility, without and indeed in place of substantive action in addressing their impact. Certainly what is different between 2010 and 2022 is the shift to future-oriented claims, the climate action discourse, as you can see in this Pathways communication, and of course, their net zero pledge. So how our research came about, there's a lot on this slide, but I'm trying to show you some of the ads that we documented. In total, we gathered 180 different pieces, data points to analyze in our article. The Clear the Air campaign was spread across various multiple media points, going as far as science fairs as well. I'll highlight, like I said, the article goes into a bunch more detail. We'll highlight just one which makes the point here. And this is looking at sort of Pathways, essentially how they failed to adequately acknowledge the total carbon footprint in their net zero plan. And this is not counting their scope 3 emissions. And therefore they're engaging in greenwashing through selective discourse. And of interest to us on screen is the statement, we're working collaboratively to achieve our goal of net zero emissions from oil sands operations by 2050. So in March 2023, a little tiny asterisk, which is probably too difficult even for you in the front to see, appeared on the ad. And it starts to differentiate with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Now, you can see I zoomed in a bit further so you can see it. And on this next slide, I've also added in definitions so you can understand sort of what this actually means. Best practices around climate change and claiming net zero dictate that at minimum, you need to acknowledge the full value chain of your emissions. This is important, especially in the context of oil, given that the burning of a barrel of oil accounts for 80% of emissions, of its GHG emissions. So this type of selective disclosure by Pathways really, it was intentional. It was intentional to forget the asterisks and then to put the asterisks up there in such a small way. So it's almost hard to see and easy to miss. This example also encapsulates Pathways' communication strategy as part of a systematic effort to associate themselves with Canadian values such as environmental stewardship, community, economic stability, and prosperity by describing their actions and their commitment to net zero in misleading and false terms. Now, as part of our research, we have all this material archived, and that's an important process to keep on doing to document these types of claims. And it became even more important in June of this year when Pathways, along with their partners, scrubbed their website. They deleted all, their website is kind of back now with lots of net zeros mentions being dropped, but they deleted all their YouTube videos are now deleted. Their Twitter account, they gave up their Twitter handle as well. All of this was gone, which we have been and continue to keep on archiving. And this was a response to the passing of an omnibus bill called Bill C-59, which included changes to the Competition Act. And these changes expanded the definition of greenwashing, which while it was already illegal, extended to claims beyond products to include services and performance, as well as put a responsibility on the people making the claims to be able to back these claims up with internationally recognized methodologies. And the failure to do so could result in stiff financial penalties. So I would suggest that our paper stands as evidence as to why something like Bill C-59 is necessary. Now, the window for public comment on Bill C-59 just closed about a week, about last Friday, I think. But since since this bill was passed, there's been an effort to delegitimate the law as censorship, as a gag order, as impeding, quote, the freedom of companies to communicate. And to be clear, it's not illegal for companies to communicate their environmental goals, and it never has been illegal for them to do so. What C-59 does is adds a degree of regulatory and law enforcement tools to address misleading and fraudulent claims. So what we plan, so there is actually, there is a deep connection, and this is touched upon in Katharine Hayhoe's speech as well, or talk as well. There's a deep connection between the freedom trope and climate denial and climate disinformation. It can be traced back to industry opposition to climate policies in the 90s, and it's certainly carried forward as part of a current culture wars, acting as both a simple heuristic as well as a trigger, bridging sort of greenwashing and misinformation and disinformation discourse. So in terms of future work, something that Chris and I are already planning to study is to look at public discourse around C59 claims, as well as looking at the discourse, which these disclosures, which will be made public by the Competition Bureau. So again, we're folding this into our 4-year SHRC. We also need to expand our understanding of greenwashing. Something that Chris and I have been talking a lot about is that what we tend to have, and what I've spent a lot of my time talking about even now, is this rather sort of Generation X view of greenwashing. This is a bit like your Adbusters type greenwashing, looking at media claims, at print, at billboards, that type of thing. This is fine, but we also must need to think about these traditional Gen X forms in tandem with digital greenwashing as well. This means thinking about the manipulation of online search, targeting the barriers to transparency around this, and looking for means for accountability around this as well that exists particularly with Google. Yes, Facebook offers ad platforms that you can see. Pathways Legacy's ads are there, but it's very, very difficult to think about the manipulation of search around Google. You can see at one point, the UNH-leg report was one of the key words where a sponsored Pathways thing would come up, right? So we need to start thinking about this. We also need to be aware about, this is some work that Melissa Ronchik is doing, sort of shining some sunlight onto the PR industry, people working in these spaces, treating it a bit like big tobacco, thinking about where are these messages coming from, right? The first 2 talks are about the impact on citizens. We're thinking about who's making these messages, what is the impact here. This is thinking about the role of big fossil fuels and adjacent funding groups, as well as looking at university funding. There's been some interesting research on this. Where are groups like CAP putting their money? What sort of research is being conducted? Is this transparent or not? My last point connects with sort of the idea to think about sort of digital and think about the rise of AI and LLMs. This means considering not only how can large language LLMs, things like ChatGPT, whatever else, how it can be used to deploy and detect greenwashing, but how it can be used to rewrite, farm, or obscure history by producing material which could be intended to be scraped and used by LLMs. We also need to think about the rise of customized and hyper-personalized ads, which is now possible, targeted ads through, and will be even be made more specific through AI. And so concluding on this point isn't about following trends or the need, it's about the need to have adaptable approaches, perspectives, and legislation which can effectively hold greenwashers to account and not just do so with a Generation X lens, but think about sort of our current media environment as well. Thank you.
So this really warmed my heart, the actually saving things before they were scrubbed. As it happens, I'm also a competition lawyer, so it kind of, the competition greenwashing thing was quite amazing, but I was like, why are they spending their money on me? I would Google the high-level expert group report and it would be Pathways. So I think that's good that you're getting beyond the Gen X thing. But just keep up the work. Okay, so now we're going to Dr. Chris Russell, who was an author of that article as well, talking about climate and flame wars, reflections on misinformation and wildfire in Canada's climate conversation.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And thanks for the invite here. It's always nice to come down to U of O, drop in behind enemy lines, see what everyone's up to down here. Congratulations to the lab on the grant, and we're really excited. The project seems like it's off to a really good start. So thanks for including me in this conversation. For those of you that can't see it on the slides, which are probably not many of you, I'm an academic director at Reclimate at Carleton University and also a professor in the School of Journalism and Communication. Let's see. So is it here? Is it this one, Patrick? Or Okay. So we were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into this space maybe 2 or 3 years ago when we got started, realizing we were going to have to think about the question of false, misleading, deceptive communication as a result of what we thought the big questions in climate communication are. And it's really, I think, these first 2 questions that we're really focused on at Reclimate. One is the obstacles to public participation and engagement with the energy transition. We really do feel that that public debates, public participation, public engagement is going to be necessary and affect the pace and ambition of the energy transition, and whether it takes on a fair and societally acceptable form. And so I think this resonates with some of the comments we heard in the earlier keynote about having to really invest in public engagement, public communication with people, finding them where they are and engaging with them. A second problem, or a second question, is the obstacles to public engagement with preparedness in response to climate impacts, especially those impacts that are experienced or associated with crisis and emergency. And that's what drew us into the question of, of having to deal with wildfires as kind of probably one of the main impacts we're going to be dealing with for a long time in this country. And we've realized that it's those climate impacts that are associated with crisis and emergency that become points of heightened engagement and contestation around climate change more generally. So while there's a ubiquity of misinformation that you can concern yourself with, there's a lot that you can figure out what to do and how to address. I think there are key moments and key points and key issues that really should be the focus of our attention as we deal with this. And it's energy transition politics and climate impacts that we've decided to focus our attention on. Now, to do this properly, I think it's worth going through the research literature that's pre-existed around this for a long while. Katharine Hayhoe pointed back to Merchants of Doubt, which came out in 2010. And so there's a long-standing conversation that I hope people engage with. But since I'm going to speed run through our climate crisis comms study, I'm going to skip over it and not follow my own advice. There's also what I would call the discourse. The discourse is high-level pundits, substackers, the place where people have very adversarial, aggro opinions on disinformation. I think that conversation has value and has to be engaged in, but I would just say that I think it's also worth mediating that engagement with an understanding of the research literature I just pointed to. But it is a thing that's going to have to be discussed. And as Patrick was pointing out, the idea that any concern with this is a sort of crypto censorship industrial complex is something that I think has to be confronted and argued with and put to the side, because it's really not about censoring or regulating content, at least in our approach. It's about making visible and accountable what's happening and thinking about what the product design and platform design structures are that have really landed us in the situation we're in. So just briefly, our approach, we believe communication is informational and relational. It's about content and the connections and sense of belonging that are formed through the sharing of content. This is really reiterating, I think, something Katharine Hayhoe was saying about identity. So it's really about recognizing the way in which content and its sharing affirms our sense of who we are. And so understanding the dynamics of that sharing and that circulation are as important as understanding what the informational value of that content is. It's about the supply of deceptive and misleading content, but also the desire and demand that many of us have for rumor and speculative explanations, and the fact that many of us do engage in this and find it enjoyable in some way. And so understanding that it's technology and the way it's set up, the way institutions are incentivized to engage in these sorts of deceptive behaviors, but also the supply and the human side in which many of us engage in it. So we're really trying to foreground a participatory and engagement-focused approach to these questions. So the wildfires in 2023. For the long while, I talked about them as an event, an extreme event. I think we now need to talk about them as seasons and prepare for them as seasons in how we cover and communicate these types of things. So I'm going to walk you through what we found. I'm sure many of you remember just how beyond the norm and how surprising the wildfires were in the 2023 season. I won't rehearse all the stats about property damage, air pollution, harm, forest burn, people under evacuation. It was horrific, right? What we wanted to do was understand what happened after the fact. So we joined up with Helen's shop. We joined up with people that have network science expertise at McGill and at Climate Action Against Disinformation. And what we wanted to do was map the climate conversation online in Canada and then look at how wildfire content moved within that climate conversation. I can talk more about this map at the end in question period if people have any questions, but our study on our report is publicly available, so you can find it there. I just want to talk briefly about what we found, and I'll tell the story through 3 spikes in engagement that we found throughout the year. The first one happened in May, with the surge of concern and wildfire peaking when the state of emergency was declared in Alberta. Much of the initial conversation was from Alberta-based accounts, contesting or asking questions, engaging in political discourse about the government's preparedness and funding of their ability to respond to wildfires in Alberta, the kind of thing you might expect. But we did detect small followings starting to suggest arson as an alternative explanation for the situation and for why it was out of control and beyond the norm. At that time, what we could notice and what became much more evident in June was that these small followers were being boosted or amplified by accounts with larger followings that weren't reproducing the content itself, but simply amplifying it. So not taking a position on it, but sort of isn't this interesting? So really trying to displace and dislodge people that were associating wildfires with climate change with an alternative explanation. Our second spike was in June when we saw the impacts reach New York City. New York City turned orange, the largest media market in the world, or one of them at least. Everyone went scurrying indoors or to emergency rooms. That brought a whole host of attention to this. And it wasn't just Alberta-based accounts, but accounts that were really active in right and anti-establishment clusters that were uplifting and giving resonance to the arson explanation. As well, a more conspiratorial form of the arson narrative became visible, one that mixed in with climate lockdown conspiracies, 15-minute city conspiracies, things that had been circulating in Canada 2 years previously, and a more radicalized variant of it began to sort of bifurcate or bridge off from the simple, maybe arsonists did it, deflection account. And what's interesting in these more conspiratorial form is that it wasn't about offering an alternative explanation to climate change, but the idea was that the government themselves may have started the fires, eco-activists or supporters of climate policy had started the fires to generate an emergency in order to have people worried about a crisis that they would then assent to climate policy being carried through as a clandestine project of state overreaching control. Yeah, fun stuff. Then in August, second set of evacuations up north, state of emergency declared in BC. Trudeau sends the military in to assist. We saw a Truth and Freedom convoy confront police on an evacuation route during this month. And we saw similar arson conspiracies start to circulate during the Maui fires. Quebec in September actually found an arsonist setting wildfires. And this was really strange because that arsonist was an anti-government conspiracist that was blaming the government for starting the wildfires and was himself out there starting wildfires. So that was something that crossed ideological wiring for people that thought this was a big win for the arson narrative, and just a kind of confusing circumstance overall. If you ask me, did climate misinformation cause this Truth and Freedom convoy to go confront police on an evacuation route, or this guy to commit arson? I'm not going to say that. I'm not sure that's the best way to pose the question, but I would say we should probably think about how those things are related and not assume they're unrelated. So just to cover the 2 arson narratives we saw, deflection, I think what we're watching, as I am, the number of stories about arson, I'm very concerned there are arsonists. References to ongoing investigations, to have 175 fires, we don't know the causes of that, that's unusual. That's from our friend Daniel Smith, really lifting up the arson narrative as a potential explanation when asked about the relationship of wildfires and climate change. Goes, I think, to the importance of elite cues that was mentioned earlier, but also the way that elected officials in particular can bridge conversations out of small communities And we heard Katharine Hayhoe talk about how small some of these accounts and actors are that are circulating these things and gaining engagement online. A lot of this wasn't covered by legacy and mainstream media, or was covered with due attention to what was happening as potential disinformation or misinformation, fact-checking, debunking, labeling. But when political elites uplift this as part of their press conferences, journalists are put in the position of whether or not to cover that sort of content, so they can bridge this into different kinds of conversations that happen. How this happened was we saw a lot of decontextualized references to older news articles about arsonists that had been caught in previous years, investigations or arrests that had happened in previous years, so those stories were decontextualized, or that had happened in different localities, say in the West Coast of the US. So these were presented as if relevant to the ongoing situation, and it was sometimes very difficult to tell whether these were older news stories or recent news stories. Decontextualized images and video in particular were circulated. I'm very excited by the idea. I think I heard Jennifer talk about investing in imaging and talking about the ways images circulate. This is a real problem and much more difficult to do than we were able to do in our study. In this narrative, references to climate change were often opposed or mocked. And what's interesting in all of this is that the association of wildfire and climate change was often made by people looking to contest the association, not by advocates going out there and insisting it be talked about in the middle of evacuations and emergency. Arson 2, I already told you about this. Climate change is actually foregrounded. Arsonists are figured as eco-terrorists or state-sponsored actors trying to generate support for climate policy. Policy is a pretext, climate policy, to state overreach, control, technological surveillance, and it's framing public health and climate emergency declarations as alarmist tactics to introduce policies that benefit global elites, the WEF, Bill Gates, take your pick. I'm actually just going to skip over this, but these are some people that you may be familiar with: Theo Fleury, Maxime Bernier, unacceptable Canadian girl who kind of has the culture wars hit list there in which climate policy is embedded. I won't talk too much because I want to leave time for conversation, but I do think we need to understand how the climate lockdown conspiracy entered the last election cycle in 2021, got boosted when media tried to debunk it, and then circulated more widely and spawned off into a series of other conspiracies. But in summary, what we found was that the arson narrative was being upheld as an alternative explanation that people could hold on to if they didn't want to talk or think about climate change, or didn't want to support climate policy as a potential solution to avoiding the sorts of climate impacts we might see in the future. We saw a variety of tactics and techniques that are pretty familiar to sustain and drive engagement with arson explanations. I've talked about the use of decontextualized video, images, news stories, as well as outright lies, but it's usually decontextualized content that is true, but is put in a context that renders its impression false. Finally, the networks of actors that developed to oppose public health policies during COVID are very active in this space and adopting their anti-public health, anti-government overreach narratives. Now that the pandemic is over, or now that public health measures are not so visible, and now that public health actors aren't at the front of our news feeds every day, they're taking up climate policy and retrofitting their narratives to talk about climate policy in the way they previously talked about public health policy, to hold their networks, to hold engagement. And so we're going to have to think about not simply industry and not simply polarized politics and politicians, although that's a big piece of it, but also this influencer, celebrity influencer class of actors that are an important element of the online conversation. Many of you will be familiar with Jordan Peterson, but he's far from the only one that's active in this space. I'm actually going to leave it there because I know we have a lot of questions and things we might want to talk about, and these are really just my impressions and not the basis of research in terms of what we've seen today. If people do want to talk about some of the solutions that were implemented during this wildfire season, what worked and what didn't, I'm happy to either do it as a group of the whole in the conversation or to meet with you after we conclude our panel today. So thank you for sticking with me to the end of this panel and this presentation, and I'll throw it back over to you, Catherine.
All right, so this was pretty awesome. I think really amazing for panelists. I'm just gonna look at Jennifer. You've got me here for doing a synthesis for half an hour. I can, what time can we go? I don't really have anything to say.
You have a hard stop at 5.
I got a hard stop at 5. So, okay, so have people thought of questions? If not, I am ready to start, but if anyone wants to ask a question, Okay, you're all gonna come with questions. Oh, we see, maybe I'll just ask one very quick question, or I'll ask it and then ask you folks at the end to answer. I mean, it's really okay. What is your one solution? Jennifer and I were talking about this, like, you know, you've talked about a lot of problems. I think, Chris, you didn't get to it. You said, here are your ideas. So maybe we can end on that. So we're very solutions focused. I don't know, maybe someone wants to ask that too, but why don't we go to the first question? The person with awesome earrings. I don't know. I'm just gonna like call you out like that, I guess. I don't know. Let's go.
Hi, Vanessa Corkle from Natural Resources Canada. And thank you so much for the presentation. Super useful information. From the policy perspective, and this kind of bridges into the solutions thing, I don't think that most policymakers and civil servants, hardworking and committed as they are, because I have wonderful colleagues, are thinking about communication as a component of policy development. So when you develop a policy, how are you going to communicate it to the public? Why is communicating that important? And I think it's becoming critical if we're going to safeguard the policies we've developed on climate, but also educate the public. And that kind of links into our obligations under the Paris Agreement to be educating the public on climate change. So I just wondered if any of you could speak to that on how policymakers' roles may need to shift to incorporate communication, and what are some solutions to kind of get public civil servants and politicians to understand that is critical.
Will make my one comment because this has come up on carbon pricing. We were literally told we could not advertise. I was told I could not spend I couldn't spend taxpayer dollars, which was bonkers because people were entitled to get money back and it was through the tax system. So first of all, we got to figure out what we're messaging, but not being able to advertise is obviously a massive hindrance when you have folks who are basically every day using, I mean, Ford was using taxpayer dollars, but folks are every day pounding the message. So first of all, if anyone wants to report that back into the government, you're going to have to actually spend some money if you actually want to land a major policy. But I mean, I think your question is more, okay, wow, how do we communicate the policy? So who wants to go, like based on, I mean, Catherine did talk about this, and I think government folks tend to be very, very technical. And I think climate is actually the worst offender. Like when I came into this world, I didn't know a thing about climate, really. I mean, I knew climate change was real. I ran because I wanted to see climate action, but then people are talking about COPs and net zero in 2050. And so I always say my son would be like, you're going to be dead at 2050. I'm like, no, actually, that's not like the plan. But, you know, it's so far out that I was trying to do the math. I was like, will I be dead? Like, you know, that's not a helpful way to be framing this. So I don't know if anyone wants to take it on based on, you know, what you saw. You can extrapolate a bit. We're not going to hold you totally, you know, in an academic way, totally responsible for solving this. But
I guess I would just say, does anyone remember the slide when Katharine Hayhoe put up the slide about when this started? Do you remember what was on that slide? Pardon me? Time Magazine, and who was the person? Yeah, does anyone recognize him? It's Jim Hansen, right? Scientist. And so what we have with climate change, unlike many other kinds of environmental issues that rose from affected communities having enough, deciding to educate themselves about the political system and the environmental systems which they were implicated, and beginning to address those and with whatever tools and collaborations they had available to them, our awareness, most of us, of science, certainly of climate change as a potential threat in the 80s and 90s, came from the scientific community. And the IPCC and the COP that you were talking about, right, the Conference of Parties, this is very much a science-led effort that I think is an incredible achievement, deserves the Nobel Prize it got. Scientists are not the problem here, but it was a science-driven effort from the get-go that we've continued to internalize as a way to move forward. And so when Hayhoe is talking about having to move past the idea that it's about some more and more scientific information, I think that's a crucial message. The second thing I would say is in Canada, we overinvested, I would say, in policy. We overinvested in technically sophisticated, complex, admirable policies that were economically driven and that involved economic rationales that we then thought people should recognize was in their best interest and accept them as provided. Now, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but I think the idea of having the policy developed by framers of policy and developed it as a kind of beautiful, technical, sophisticated way of changing the world misunderstands the idea of the role of public engagement and the role of public participation. And so I think it's not only just understanding where people are so that you can tell them that the policy you have, but you have to be in constant engagement with them so that they feel buy-in, whether the policy they get is the one they want, they feel buy-in and they feel their knowledge and their views and their voices and their experiences are reflected in the policies you developed, as opposed to you figuring it out and then showing up at their doorstep and trying to win their vote or trying to win their consent. So I would say that's the high level sort of mind shift that I would kind of recommend. Obviously, I'm part of a group of people that started an organization called Reclimate that's dedicated to that sort of thing. So kind of just full disclosure around kind of where I'm coming from here. But I think it's a crucial question. And I think it's kind of what's going to be important to holding on to a good and fair and socially acceptable energy transition and dealing with the worse and more negative impacts that we're going to see.
Who else? Does anyone else want to take it? Yeah. Sure.
Okay, just one quick thing I'll add to Chris is that I think a major part of policy development and communication about policy on environment has to do with the fact that we need to start viewing climate policy and conversations about regulation of environment not in a silo. Like, we need to realize that it's an issue of platform governance, it's an issue of online harms, it's an issue of the way that people engage on a daily basis with like their own views of how to impact their environmental footprint. It's about public participation. It's about bringing people into conversations, meeting them where they're at. All of these fundamental things that we view as integral to the policy process, like public consultation, like public participation, I think need to play a bigger role in the way we come to understand how to craft climate policy.
Maybe just to a broader perspective, also from a political science perspective. I mean, we see for the last 60 years, civic education is non-existent. People know less and less about politics, including, I mean, because these factors are related. They are related to ideology. I mean, we had the same idea when the same misinformation for COVID. We have the same information for other areas. And I think a big issue, and it also responds, what can governments, what can the public do? I mean, I'm in the university, for example, people don't have to take political science classes. In most high schools, there's no civic education. And if we know, I mean, if we look at political knowledge of young people compared to now, 40, 50 years ago, it's tanking and we don't do anything. And I mean, there needs to be a little bit of, or a certain amount of political literacy to understand these issues. And we don't provide these. I mean, we don't talk about, why don't we have mandatory classes from, I don't know, from grade 10 to grade 12 in civic education? Why don't we ask people at the university to take classes? Everybody needs to take math, but it's also important to understand how the system works, how the science works, and what's true and what's not true. But if you don't give these skills, and that's not a question of education, a lot of educated people don't have them. Talk to people in the hard sciences, not to blame anyone, but they know nothing about political science, nothing. And I would even say, let them do the citizen. I mean, I'm just applying for citizenship. So I don't think that a lot of our students here would pass the citizenship test. So I think this is really crucial, and we don't attack this. There's a really big lack of civic knowledge in the public, especially among young people, and for every generation it's declining, and we're not doing anything. And I think this feeds into polarization, this feeds into growing ideology, and this feeds on misinformation, including misinformation about climate change.
Maybe we'll move on because I think we've got a lot of questions. I just want to flag one thing because I spent all my time thinking about comms now on climate, and I would say citizens' assemblies. Like, I'm now coming to the viewpoint that we need to actually use citizens as a resource and publicize these discussions, because I actually think you could have an energy worker and someone from downtown Montreal, if you agree on basic facts, like you got to reduce your emissions by a certain amount. It can't just be what do you want to do, and it's not going to meet a reduction in emissions, but I do think there's a real opportunity to do that, having seen them in action and seeing things that are, people are actually, 80% of people want more action on climate than their governments are giving. Women are 2.5 times more likely to want climate action, and we are not tapping into that as a resource. And you saw in France, they were able to say no short haul fights. 1 hour, you won't do that. We would never do that as a government. There's no way the government would ever do that for a whole range of reasons. But I do think you could get more ambition if people actually have facts, but you also then live stream it so people can actually see, and the government accept the recommendations, whether or not they agree with them and implement them. That's a different thing. They'll be held accountable, I think, in an election. So I do think there's some resonance potentially on that. Okay, so we got, how many people do we have right now? We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so why don't we take 2 at a time? So I'll come back to you at the end because you've already had one question. So I do want to give people an opportunity. We actually have someone that I know, but yes, you'll give one. And then we will have, I think we have a gentleman back there. And we have someone else. I can't see someone. There was another hand. So that person will come next. 1, 2, 3. Then we can come back to the 4th.
So I couldn't agree more with you and so many people here, because my whole life's work has been teaching people how to communicate. And there used to be years ago at Natural Resources and many different government departments where they would get training, and we would teach the experts on how to communicate on many issues. And even we went out to Kamloops to work with First Nations just in June about wildfires and all of that. So all of the issues we've had a familiarization in. However, there's no question that the rise of misinformation, disinformation has grown so much, to the point where Jennifer Irish and Barry McLaughlin and myself, Laura Peck, we will do a seminar on misinformation, disinformation in November, the 26th, 27th, 28th. Yeah, we're going to do that together. So go ahead, give me any information that you want or any kind of suggestion. Like our earlier speaker talked about head meeting heart, and she's absolutely right. She's right. When my mother found out you couldn't ski anymore in Cape Breton, where I'm from, that's climate change. Oh, definitely, that's climate change. I just talked to her before I come in here, and so it makes a big difference. So if you've got any, but it's got to be to the point. You know, we call it the positioning statement, even though I honor all the data and the papers and all that. But go ahead and give me a positioning statement on any of the messages that you want to get out there, because my goodness, the keyboard warriors, the bullies out there, they're out to say the worst things about some of us. And it's not nice, it's not pleasant, but that's what happens. So I'm open to your suggestions if you have any. Thank you very much. Who's my next?
Laura, and then we have, I think, a gentleman back there who has something to say. I will say the government doesn't always use the tools. Like when I was minister responsible for weather, I mean, people said like I changed the weather because I was like all powerful, but I wasn't. But I mean, we could use that because attribution or even just facts about weather and climate, we wouldn't use it. Everything was seen too political. Like parks, we could use parks to talk about things. There's an app there. Like it was an interesting thing because I was like, okay, I'm just trying to come up with some ideas here. And these are things that people care about, right? Like people care about weather. Probably the most effective has been the Weather Network when they gutted it, but they actually were, talking about weather and climate, and people love it. Like storm chasers, everyone wants to go see the storm chaser. Well, now we have attribution science, but people have to be a little bit less nervous all the time. Like it's very hard then to do good comms if you're always worried about, this is political. And by the way, the government should also they should be calling out pathways and stop meeting with them. I will say that is like the #1 most important thing, and that is NRCan as much as probably more than anyone else. That is appalling, is that they are under investigation for misleading advertising, and they are met with through regular channels. When you do consultation on all policies, you meet with everyone. But actually, I said, and I've said this, So this is a little bit, I know, me on a little rant, but every time someone meets with a lobbyist, an oil and gas lobbyist, they should meet with a young person who wants to talk about climate change. And then you can decide the future for Canada that we want. I think that's a little more fair for people. So my little, yeah, there you go. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. My name is Sam Berridge, and I'm the High Commissioner for St. Kitts and Nevis, one of the smallest countries in the world. And St. Kitts and Nevis.
Oh, St. Kitts and
Yes,
Nevis.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
great.
And we have a strategic partnership with the U Ottawa, and we always, me and my colleague here, Kervin Lloyd, we always come to support and participate in the sessions. Now, this is very important for us because sustainability is an existential issue for us, climate change, sea level rise, and all of the impacts. Now, where does the matter of plastics pollution and vis-a-vis recycling, where does it fall into this whole debate of misinformation and disinformation? Because there are some people who tell you that you can recycle plastics in a sustainable way without increasing emissions, but then it depends on who is singing the tune or who is paying the piper. I've heard of oil companies actually purporting and advocating for recycling in a sustainable way. That seems counterintuitive to me. So I should indicate that we have a strategic partnership with the government of Canada on dealing with plastics pollution. And if you see the documentaries out there, they are scary. You know, when it comes to the plastics ending up in the water channels and everything, how do we unpack the whole issue of single-use plastics and recycling in the context of information and disinformation? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And I will say the same people that actually foster disinformation and misinformation on climate change are the same ones who do it in plastics, because it's produced by who? Fossil fuel companies. I'm just going to say, like, that is a real thing. But I mean, this is probably, you know, it's a bit more of a narrow topic. I don't know if anyone wants to take up this. They're going to take it on as their next research study. But I think maybe the one point I would say, and I think it's really important that you're here and that you raise your voices, because I think Catherine said, like, climate change affects people in different ways, and some people who've done the least to cause it are affected the most, and that is your country. Small island developing states will be underwater at 1.5 degrees. And I think that sometimes, and I don't want to be like Debbie Downer, but we have to be realistic about this, and actually people hearing from people about that. Like in the climate conference, there'll be all these scientists and all these people saying their talking points, and the most compelling often is someone who comes, often a young person from a small island developing state, saying, like, my homeland will be gone. Like, and that I think is, we got to get real about this. And Canada's the 5th largest exporter of fossil fuels. So sometimes, like, here, I feel in Canada, like I go to Climate Week and I'm saying things, I come here and our conversation is very different. Now we have to be cognizant of how people process information, but I think we also need to know that our impacts are on your country, everyone, and we're the largest one of the largest per cap emitters. So I think but it's hard to, how do you correct all these facts? How do you deal with information? How do you touch hearts and hands? It's a lot on a comms exercise, but I think it is really important, and thank you for coming. Okay, I think there's a person back there I cannot see. And we are coming back to you next, don't worry. And anyone else, so let's just see anyone else, hands. Okay, you put your hand on your heart, then you're doing both at once. That was a joke. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. Hello, my name is Marnie, and I work at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. My question has actually evolved significantly as the presentations continued, so it was really helpful to have the opportunity to ask it after hearing all the presentations. So my question is about intersectionality. Dr. Stockenmaier's presentation touched on identity factors, and I believe that information was disaggregated, but it shows that we do have the data, and we know that Dr. Hayhoe talked about the need to meet people where they are. And then Dr. McCurdy talked about the weaponization of targeted ads by the fossil fuel industry. So my question is, do we need to have a portfolio of messaging that's distinct and targeted by identity factors rather than a homogenous comms approach? And could we use targeted ads? Could we flip the script and use them in the same way so that we're getting the right variation of the message to the right audience?
Good question. I'm going to give this because I'm not a scientist or anything, but I think like obviously, and I feel that I was as guilty as anyone, like trying to do one message for everyone is really hard. And people, you know, that are involved in the oil and gas industry will hear things differently. So I think that's probably smart. Whether government can do that is a very big challenge. But everyone's just looking at, they're like, I'm not touching this.
But I mean, that's basically the keynote answer to this question, I would say.
Yeah.
To take the people from where they are. And I think that was a very good point. So I think we don't have very much to add. But yes, so the answer is yes.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, there's a good group. They actually do projections on climate. I'm trying to think if they were out of University, maybe Waterloo. And so you can go see what will happen at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. That is obviously important. But what they also do, and I'm trying to think what it is called. It's called climate something, but there's like hundreds of those. But they go and they have a farmer. And it's a farmer in Saskatchewan talking about seeing the land dry up. And then he gets emotional and he talks, he's not talking about climate change. I think this is what Catherine's talking about. Like he is talking about like, what is the future for his farm and for his kids? And I think like, it could be someone who fishes. And the challenge, of course, of that is you have to find the right person. Like the last person anyone wants to hear is a politician, I guess, these days. But I think it's actually finding someone who authentically can talk like that. It's just micro-targeting people, and also assumptions about people is hard too. Because I mean, obviously there are many people in Alberta who support climate action, right? Like, so you gotta be like, it's probably, I mean, it's very smart. I agree, it's very smart. It's harder. I will say in carbon pricing, probably the best thing happened when we weren't allowed to advertise. I went around and I saw H&R Block had the climate action incentive in the window. I was like, wait, they're doing our advertising. And I realized they just wanted to bring people in. So then we just went and I said every member of parliament had to go with a family. And then they had to do a social media video and I didn't want them in it. I didn't care if they were in it. Like, it wasn't about them. It was the family hearing how much money they would get back and being interested in that and your kids. So I do really think that's compelling. It's just like, it's hard probably for governments to enact that and also find the right people. But if I can figure out the name, I will tell you, because you can go look at these videos. And actually, I think people could circulate these videos. They're very thoughtful. And they literally take a part of the country. They show the projections on 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3. It's petrifying over time. And then they actually have someone talking about it who's just a regular person. Yes.
Yeah, just briefly.
I'm just filling time now. I don't know. I'm answering. I don't have any solutions.
So many good questions. Thank you for that question. We will have a report coming out later this month called 5 Canadas. So there will be some data on that. We won't have to keep going back to Yale for the 7 Americas. That will help with some of the differentiation among different audience segments or personas or whatever you might want to call them. I would definitely agree with this idea that the kind of the farmer story you told. And when I was talking earlier about understanding sort of the influencer economy that operates, it's not that influencers better understand the digital networks and are wizards at how to influence people and they hold skills all of us don't have. What they do is they come up, they talk to the communities they're from. And so the key is really to identify people in those communities that can kind of carry the message that climate policy or climate impacts or energy transition is something that needs to be talked about in that in that community and equipping people with the training or the resources and the ability to withstand what might come to them. You know, when I was hearing you talk about harassment, and we've heard this come up several times today, and I think it's worth noting not just as a funny thing that happens to people that can withstand it. There's some that have had to step out of this space as a result of that. There's a very interesting story. I'll make this really brief. It's a weathercaster in, it was either Iowa or Idaho, I don't know if people know this story, who would constantly contextualize his weather reporting with climate communication. He was subject to forms of harassment to the point that he could no longer take it, resigned his position. Once he resigned his position, a whole host of other people that enjoyed what he had to say came forward to tell him after the fact. And when he was asked if he had known about that previously, would it have made a difference? He said it probably would have. And so I think there's something in that for all of us to hold when people show up with stories about harassment, not just like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, but how as a community, people can kind of come together and help people work through those very challenging aspects that are going to be pervasive for people that step into this space. But certainly I would agree that we need to think about the stories that are already told in communities that are about climate change already, and just helping people see how those connections can be made in the conversations they're already having with each other. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chris. So it's climateatlas.ca. I can't tell because I'm on my phone. It's like a little bit cumbersome, but they have like one projections per city. So it's actually quite interesting because I think everyone lives in a city or a town or something. So you can see what it looks like, what your future might look like under scenarios, but it also has some videos. Okay, I know, sadly, I know this, the person who wanted to talk next, Jennifer is gonna kill me if I don't. Sorry, I just have to obey the, I think unfortunately, unless Jennifer indulges people, we're gonna have to hand it back to Jennifer. I'm just scared, you know, I'm just scared. I'm just a person here doing my job. Okay, we're handing it back to Jennifer, but there are people who I think anyone's happy to answer any questions sometime afterwards. Thank you very much, and just keep on keeping on. And if anyone calls you out, I will get out there. I don't give a fuck.
So this has been in part a context provider to a presentation of what the lab can do about this. Obviously, this is a big issue. We've been framed a number of different lenses to the question. I'm just trying to move the slide forward. Oh, there we go. And we have to really pick and choose our priorities going forward. So first of all, the Information Integrity Lab is not just about climate change. It's one of our highest priority issues, along with protecting democracy, which is also kind of a big issue. And we do public health. But with a grant kindly provided by the Trottier Foundation has enabled us to really go big on climate change. We want to take advantage of that and make sure that we can do good work in this area. So in terms of the lab as a whole, we've only been around for 2 years. Our mandate is to advance the awareness and understanding of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation is information that is false narratives at variance with verifiable facts. Disinformation is false narratives at variance with verifiable facts, which is deliberately spread in order to cause harm. So there's an intention with disinformation. Malinformation is actually factual information, but that is disseminated in a way or in a manner to cause harm. This could be like, for example, an example often used is Hillary Clinton's emails in 2016. No one contested that those were actually those emails, but it was done and timed in a way to cause harm. So that would be malinformation. Most of our work is actually about misinformation and disinformation. So in terms of our mission, we have a mandate tripod, we call it. We serve as a hub for innovative analysis and tools. So what is that? What does that mean? Well, there's two parts of our analysis. One part of our analysis is kind of what we've been doing today. So we study the impacts, the drivers, and the information ecosystem issues which lead to disinformation. We study its impacts, its sources. Why is it harmful? And we also develop studies around particular actors or particular sectors to deepen our knowledge in that. The second part of our analysis is the innovation side. So we are also in parallel developing data sets, data analytics, and AI-enabled research to allow us to look at volume of mis and disinformation narratives. We're starting with pre-existing data sets. It's climate change is great for that because there are a lot of pre-existing data sets that are science-based that have been peer-reviewed. So we're starting with, in the case of climate change, with pre-existing data sets, but organized through graph data sets. It's called through science and narratives. So that's our starting point for this. And as we proceed through our 3-year cycle, we do hope to be able to provide knowledge mobilization products from that basically allow us to scrape social media or use our data sets as a research tool to generate our findings. Alongside is knowledge mobilization, so to develop, continue to develop expertise in the area of mis and disinformation. So there's a big community out there and a small community out there. The Europeans are doing quite a lot of interesting work in terms of different approaches to mis and disinformation that we are leveraging. The United States as well is taking a different approach, more a targeted approach. But we are learning about what are the different sources of mis-disinformation, how we also mitigate it, and that will in part enable us to become more of a center of expertise in this area. And the third is it's pretty arrogant for us to say we've only been around 2 years and we're like the arbiters of all this. Is not true. Actually, we want to position ourselves as a convener. We want to position ourselves as a convener, as a networker, to enable voices come through, even from Carleton University. I mean, I think that shows just how enlightened we are. That we can get voices across the country, and there's lots of centers of expertise across Canada. It's interesting; they're all dealing with a different slice of the pie. And so by framing questions, by doing events like this, we hope to be able to leverage and hear those voices. And certainly in the first stages of this work program, we're going to be actively listening and doing a mapping to analyze what are the gaps. What are those gaps that where we can position ourselves for excellence and really increase our impact? And the other thing I would just stress about our mandate, that we are more practically focused. While we are in a university, we're not academics. I'm sorry, academics. But we are in part practitioners. So we can, a lot of our publications, you have an example before you today on the literature review we've done on climate change and mis and disinformation. They're aimed at not at other academics necessarily, but at the public. Like they're meant to be accessible publications written more as white papers and discussion papers than as academically quality research. Now we will be doing some of that as well, but we find that our sweet spot is really on those Paul's publications. And I just want to recognize Nico Rutherford, who's our senior analyst, who actually did do that literature review, which was very complicated on climate change and mis and disinformation. And just take a point for a shout out for him. So these parts of our mission are going to be fully leveraged as we develop a roadmap. That roadmap, the biggest sort of single inflection point in that roadmap is a global summit on climate, mis and disinformation, which we are organizing for June 2025. But in the preparation for that, there's a series of different milestones that we will hit. And well, that's an inflection point. So that will be a time for us to be able to showcase our findings, our tools, toolkits, and we still have time in our work program afterwards to make sure that we are doing a rollout, including a more public-facing appreciation of the issues. So these are the pillars that we've identified for the roadmap going forward. for climate change and disinformation. So the first is, again, flowing from our mandate, the innovative analytic capacity and tool development. So that's two things in one. That's in part our data set analysis, and it's also a visual and disinformation analysis and tools that we are developing in cooperation with our good friends at CRIM. I'd like to give them a shout out as well. They're key partners with us on this journey. The second is on innovative research experiences and different approaches to dealing with mis and disinformation. And last but not least, we want to really come out of the summit with a consolidated climate disinformation network in Canada that also has a work plan going forward, which will in part be research oriented and in part to be dealing with some of the inoculation measures that we were talking about earlier today. So just going one by one, but extremely briefly. So yeah, the data and the detection of mis and disinformation is going to be key in this. We're also developing methodologies for assessing narrative risk. There's different approaches for analyzing mis and disinformation. We are taking a narrative risk approach to our textual mis and disinformation. So that's looking at what is the threat of a narrative on the basis of how fast it is accelerating through algorithms and how harmful it can be. So those are the two axes that we are working for in our methodology. We're adapting it from a risk assessment methodology that was developed actually for risk management within the private sector, but we feel that there is a real applicability to the methodology to what we're trying to do in terms of assessing mis and disinformation. So we are applying that into the lab's mission and through our PRISM. So we also are already doing quite a bit of work with CRIM. We had an event earlier this year on visual and multimodal mis and disinformation. Unfortunately, our publication became out of date. I think the point of publication, Uman, or at least a few months after, that is how fast techniques for manipulating visual and multimodal disinformation are accelerating. And so we are doing a new one that will be out shortly in the next couple of months, which will also take a strong climate change lens. But this is a key issue, probably maybe the sexiest issue that's talked about in mis and disinformation is deep fakes. Deep fakes are not always damaging. There's a lot of fun that goes with manipulation in the visual world, but we need to set up methodologies so we know when we can detect them and when they are particularly harmful in terms of perpetuating mis and disinformation, distorting the facts on which we make our decision. And the last category is one we've touched upon as well during the course of this event, is what do we do about it? What's the mitigation? What's the countermeasures, tools, and strategies? And we've done also some work in this area in our digital democracy program, where we're learning that the approach really depends upon the issue. And when climate change, we'll be exploring sort of what are the actual tactics that are most appropriate to dealing with different types of narratives. So we've talked about pre-bunking. Pre-bunking is an inoculation tool. How do you prepare your public for what's coming and get ahead of the narrative? And this is something I think that is probably the most promising field right now. The Europeans are investing a lot of work in AI to kind of predict narratives going forward, and then coming in to then develop pre-bunking in response to that. The other is, I think Catherine referred to this a lot about debunking. So how do you make sure that when misinformation comes out, it's quickly and effectively debunked? And it's got to be quick, because we know that these algorithms accelerate narratives extremely quickly, and it is becoming more and more challenging to get ahead of that. And the third tool is counter narratives. So as well as debunking, how do you actually do counter narratives that are effective in dealing with mis and disinformation? And a third area, which is more in the visual and multimodal area that we are also doing some work in, is how do you do it through developing a contextual understanding? We have a technology we're trying to advance, and we will be advancing through this program, which effectively brings together distorted and real factual visual information that allows a user effectively to explore the differences and come to their own conclusions. And that's what we're learning, that especially in dealing with conspiracy theorists, the type that Professor Stockamer analyzes, that having people come to their own conclusions is sometimes the most effective way of communicating in response to dangerous mis and disinformation narratives. So I'm not going to read slides, but there are some things I want to take out from this. So in terms of our path going forward, in this phase 1 that we are dealing with now, we want to bring more like roundtables together. So we're going to be dealing with focus groups. Richard, Daniel, others on the team done a lot of work in terms of mapping out the players across Canada, not just academics, but practitioners. We're trying to also reach out to those in the private sector more. I think we need to build a big tent, and in here, there's lots of good work going on now. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding what work is already underway, how we understand the landscape better, and then how we identify those gaps to make sure that we can be as impactful as we can. Same with mitigation tools and strategies. So we're doing that same kind of work. What tools and strategies work, why, and how can we make sure that those are capitalized and developed as part of our work. We will also continue to do knowledge sources, more informed by our data work as that progresses, but both on narratives, on sources, how those sources are funded, and what their impacts are. A big inflection in our path to the Global Summit will be a separate conference at CRIM in Montreal in late March 2025. Am I allowed to say March 27th, Francois? Oh, 25, okay. Okay, it's going to be Thursday, March 25. Okay. March 27th to 2025. Okay, so you've heard it here first. It's breaking news. And there we're going to really focus on the visual and multimodal disinformation. And it's going to be showcasing tools and techniques. And part of, again, that solutions focus we're trying to bring, we are also doing a research poster competition in advance of the summit, which will also be focused more on solutions focus. And it'll be Andrew Heffernan, who's also an associate professor here at the University of Ottawa. So all of his students who are maybe in this room, please do participate in that research poster initiative. And then tools and toolkits, which will advance for the summit and also for public distribution. We plan a number of different studies. So we showcase the literature review today. Andrew is also going to be leading a research project on climate change and mis and disinformation, which is more solutions focused, which will come out by the end of the calendar year. We have a number of other publications that are already in the pipe, including Disinformation Science. We'll be doing more work on climate change conspiracies, the visual multimodal disinformation, and also on the Arctic. So we'll do a parallel event on Arctic disinformation, including how it affects Indigenous communities in the Arctic. So in terms of the roundtable discussions that we will be launching soon, like through focus groups and then formal roundtable in January, these are the 4 themes that we will be looking at. One is just analyzing that landscape. The others is understanding technical drivers and amplifiers to mis and disinformation, how we can build public awareness and resiliency. That's again that inoculation that we've been speaking about. And then what are the practical, actionable solutions and policy responses that we can take or we can develop? Again, this is not just the lab, but we hope as part of a network that we will be crystallizing as we proceed towards the summit. So the summit goal is to improve the understanding awareness of climate misinformation, but also how we promote solutions. So we want to make sure that we developing a plan. Again, we'll have a solutions fair as part of this summit where these different types of toolkits can be experimented upon, maybe even a hackathon, but other ways in which we can actually bring forward a solutions lens to the work. And then we hope to be able to consolidate a network and an ongoing capacity to detect and counter mis and disinformation through a balance of inoculation measures and intervention measures. That's that pre-bunking, bunking, counter-narrative approach. So next steps, I'm not going to run through these because I'm going to promise from this conference that by the end of the month, you'll get a roadmap with milestones and expectations. And I think I've talked about most of these steps anyway, but starting with the focus groups, then we'll have the roundtables formally in January, which will be cross Canada, experts and practitioners, and then the conference and the summit. And then post-summit, we will hope to be able to have a more public-facing approach to our solutions work and dissemination of our work and an ongoing capacity to detect, which will be ingrained in our work of the lab. So this is my message to you. Engage with us, reach out to us, be part of this roadmap, or sponsor us. Because there's lots of work still to be sponsored, and we will calibrate our activities in accordance to our capacity, and then and be part of our solutions, because that's what we hope to generate is not just publications, not just a summit, but we hope to actually generate ongoing practical solutions for dealing with this issue of mis and disinformation and climate change, which really does, as I think it's brought forward in our panels, certainly by Dr. Hayhoe, how this really affects our information ecosystem. It's distorting perceptions and thereby impeding our capacity to act and decision makers' capacity to act. And so this is just this is how you can find us on the web. We have lots of information on our publications, our methodologies, our events coming up. And there was supposed to be a slide on how to contact us, but you can contact us through the PDI website address, and we'll make sure that that's disseminated to you as well. Just put in the subject line for the Information Integrity Lab, and we'll make sure to get back to you. So, if there's no further questions about the work plan, I do pledge to get that to you by the end of the month with laid out what are the milestones, what are the expectations, what we hope to achieve, how we're going to measure success, and we'll get that into your hands by the end of the month. So it's my pleasure to pass the mic back to Serge Blais.
Right on time. So really, I'm just here to present Mr. Eric Saint-Pierre, and I'm so happy we still have a full house at this time of day to listen to Mr. Saint-Pierre's closing remarks. Monsieur Eric Saint-Pierre is the executive director of the Trottier Family Foundation, has been executive director for the past 8 years, a proud graduate from the Faculty of Law, McGill University, and has practiced Indigenous and environmental law for about 5 years, pardon me, before joining the Trottier Foundation. A word on the Trottier Family Foundation is a multi-million-dollar foundation. It's a very, very large foundation. Supports programs in climate, environment, education, health, and science. It is based in Montreal. It is a private family foundation established in 2000 by Mr. Laurent Trottier and Madame Louise Roussel. So over to Monsieur Eric Saint-Pierre to give the closing remarks. And after that, please don't rush away. There is a networking session. There's no scotch, is there? No. Mocktail. Okay, fake scotch and the like. So you're welcome to stay for as long as you want. Okay, thank you, Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
All right, as Serge mentioned, with the Trottier Foundation, we support the lab, but we do not fund climate disinformation, just for the record. So I think I have the really hard task of speaking right before mocktails, and you've had a long day. So I'm going to try to keep it brief. I had a little bit of fun. I was really excited because Catherine was coming here, and my other favorite Catherine was speaking. So I'm having like a Catherine moment right now. So I thought today was absolutely excellent. And I got a little excited this morning when I was like writing my speech. I presented it to my daughters, and I was like, I'm going to make up some scenarios that show how climate disinformation can actually roll back climate policy. I'm going to try to keep it short. I could have gone for like hours, but this is like completely fictional. Catherine, don't retweet this. It's fake. I'm making it up right now. But it's just to show the power of disinformation and how it can roll back climate policy. So I think we've been pretty lucky in the last decade or so where Canada's been fairly ambitious on climate policy. But imagine it's October 1st, 2026, so exactly 2 years from now. Canadians have a new federal government. The axe that tax rhetoric has been successful, and consumer carbon pricing is now a thing of the past. Various climate policies have equally been dismantled. The emissions cap, methane regulations, support for programs like the Canadian Climate Institute, EV subsidies are gone, clean electricity regulations, Bill C59 is under attack, and COP, Canada was an embarrassment at COP in Brazil. So I think Catherine is probably really depressed hearing me talk about this. But just think about a scenario where climate disinformation is pervasive within Canada. So imagine a scenario where a new government is talking about introducing taxes on electric vehicles because they don't pay fuel taxes. They're trying to help provinces to tax EVs under the auspices that they're worse than ICE cars or internal combustion engines. So the war on EVs has really begun. This fits with Helen Hayes' findings of a spread of new climate delay narratives. Secondly, imagine increasing rhetoric about heat pumps being bad for Canada. Misinformation starts spreading that heat pumps don't even work at all in Canada's cold climate. I mean, I have one at home. So there's unreliable information that starts spreading. Also, fake conspiracies are promoted by rebel news that heat pumps and their noises causes cancer. Thus, a good excuse to scrap all building programs throughout Canada. Increasingly, fake news websites claim that heat pumps are causing people to eat their neighbors' cats and dogs, despite any evidence. So this sort of fits into Dr. Daniel Stockheimer's findings, and he actually publishes a new book, and it becomes a New York Times bestseller because of it. It's totally fake, totally didn't happen. You will get the New York Times bestseller one day, I'm convinced. Third, imagine an increasing rhetoric against climate activists in Canada, environmental charities, where climate activists are considered spies. AstroTurf groups have a full campaign against climate activists. They're calling out climate advocates as secret arsonists and climate authoritarians. We could see the Canada Revenue Agency going after charities like mine, but others. Dr. Chris Russell will have a hard time keeping track of the various climate misinformation campaigns. And lastly, imagine a scenario where oil and gas is touted as the best tool to fight climate change. And there's a misinformation campaign against renewables. So Nova Scotia is trying to promote renewables right now with 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. So a campaign is launched where they're supporting fishermen and the oil and gas industry supporting local communities to try to roll back renewables under the auspices that they're bad for whales. Meanwhile, commercial fishing is probably showing that there's stronger links. So I think Dr. Patrick McCurdy even reveals a report that Nova Scotia fishing industry and local communities have been heavily funded by oil and gas industry. So I'm not trying to depress you with these scenarios, but it's just to show that climate disinformation and misinformation can actually be utilized to roll back climate policy. We've actually seen this in Canada. In my hometown, Montreal, Friends of Science published billboard ads about a decade ago when we were still denying climate change. And they basically said, you know, climate is caused by the sun, it's not man-made. So they're actually putting up these billboard ads in places like Montreal. There's actually other work right now by Voice for Energy, which they're battling municipalities in British Columbia that are trying to ban natural gas in new buildings. Voice for Energy is funded by oil industry, basically trying to advocate for energy choices, but essentially trying to roll back local climate policy, and they're succeeding. So Vancouver recently made a decision to roll back their prohibition against natural gas in new buildings. And so they're using energy affordability as an excuse, and they're using a lot of disinformation. We also have Modern Miracle Network, which touts oil and gas as saving lives and making your life better, and pretending to be Canadians just like us, but being funded by Michael Binion and vested interests. So I think we need to be really concerned about climate disinformation. It's not just about how it's persuading individuals. It actually has the impact of like rolling back climate policy when we need it the most, and we don't have a lot of time. So we need to really equip journalists to do better. We need to equip universities like University of Ottawa and the lab to do better. So, Trotse Foundation, we're really, really proud to be supporting the lab. We think this is really important work. It was just described the work that you're doing on the convening and the research with CRIM as well. So we think this is really important, and we're really proud supporters of the work you're doing. So thank you for this, and let's find some interesting solutions to fight disinformation. Okay, we can have cocktails now and mocktails. Thanks.
Maybe just one last word. There's always a last word. Of course, I have to thank Director Jennifer Irish for conceptualizing this program. Her team, Danielle, Nicholas Rutherford, Richard Pinet, Dave McMahon, who's hiding back there somewhere, and of course the PDI staff behind the scenes, Sonia Obramovich, Marie Dickinson, and Paul Grenon, helping make this happen. I think you can agree that we have our work cut out for us. We do have 3-year funding from Trottier, which will allow us to continue the work and seek other sources of support, of course, to ensure the continuity of this, alas, never-ending problem. Thank you for staying behind. Please stay for as long as you want. Parking is expensive, but not that expensive. I think it's a worthy cause. Thank you again. Merci, Jennifer.